Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to Day 2 of the Doha Forum, where we continue with our exploration of global trends and look at how they are reshaping the lives and political realities of countries across the global South. Today, this morning, we turn our attention to Latin America, where countries are pursuing a more autonomous, inclusive, and multipolar regional order, one that isn't simply an extension of great power interests and priorities. We see this in their trade diversification, their engaged diplomacy, and their efforts to revive regional blocs. Organizations like CELAC, UNASUR, and Mercosur are seen as platforms for Latin America to express its own vision for the future, to articulate its own principles and pursue its own rules-based order, one that is grounded in international law, in justice and solidarity. An order that seeks equality among all nations, that prioritizes the dignity of all people and rejects the selective application of norms by powerful countries. Our panel, Paths to Prosperity in Latin America, the role of cross-regional diplomacy, looks at how the region is shaping its own new vision for a more balanced, a more inclusive, and a genuinely multilateral global system. It is my pleasure now to invite our distinguished panelists to the stage, Their Excellencies Mohammed bin Abdulaziz Al Khulaifi, Minister of State of the State of Qatar; Carlos Martio Cosandé, Secretary of Multilateral Political Affairs of the Federal Republic of Brazil; Luis Alberto Castiglioni, former Vice President of the Republic of Paraguay; Alejandro Sanchez Pereira, Secretary of the Presidency of the Republic of Uruguay; Diego Martinez Bello, State Secretary for Foreign and Global Affairs of the Kingdom of Spain. Please join us on stage, and please welcome the moderator of this panel, Charles Powell, Director of Elcano Royal Institute. Welcome.
Good morning, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. My name is Charles Powell, and I'm the director of the Elcano Royal Institute, Real Instituto Elcano in Madrid, which is Spain's leading international relations think tank. And before I start, let me just say what a pleasure and an honor it is to be partnering with the Doha Forum here today. As has just been said, I think this is an extremely timely meeting. The multilateral order is clearly under threat. Some countries have responded to this by developing minilateral organizations and procedures, but it is also in this context that cross-regional diplomacy has really come into its own, and that is basically what we are going to explore this morning. And I will first of all ask His Excellency Mohammed bin Abdulaziz Al Khulaifi to tell us about how Qatar sees cross-regional diplomacy. What are the biggest challenges in achieving your goals? We heard yesterday that you have just signed a very important agreement with Colombia, which, as I was telling you earlier, is one of my favorite countries in the world. So I'm extremely grateful to you. Congratulations. And I particularly wanted to ask you, what does Qatar bring to the table specifically? What are Qatar's advantages when it comes to dealing with cross-regional diplomacy?
Thank you so much for this comprehensive question. I'll try to be short but very direct. Mediation is a strategic pillar in our foreign policy. We've been very much engaged with several requests from friends around the globe to ask Qatar to mediate and resolve conflicts between the disputing parties. We've been engaged in cases in East and West without any geographical boundaries. And I think that's the unique elements of Qatar's approach, that we don't have a limitation or geographical limitation in terms of our approach to those different conflicts. In spite of their difficulties and sometimes conflicts that are deeply rooted for years between the disputing parties. But we've managed to add elements of neutrality, trust, and new initiatives that can bring the parties together. I think the role of a mediator is really to build bridges and fill the gaps between the disputing parties. And that's what Qatar has been unique for. We've been dealing with cases globally that has been known as the most complicated and difficult cases. Of course, the mediation between the Palestinians and the Israelis comes at the top of the list. But when it comes to Latin America, it's a very important and strategic approach for the state of Qatar. We've been recently engaged in several cases. In the last 4 years, we've been very engaged in the case between Venezuela and the United States, and between the previous US administration, the Biden administration, and the Venezuela governments. That was honestly an important experience for us that built Qatar's reputation in the continent of Latin America. We have received several requests following up that, including the recent achievements in Colombia that we have managed to achieve with our partners from Spain, Switzerland, and Norway. It's a very important milestone, but I think it's when you were referring honestly to cross-regional diplomacy, it's a very important terminology that needs to be applied at a higher level. People and countries, governments cannot always resolve their conflicts within their regional territories. Relying on trusted partners internationally is always a useful tool in trying to bring the disputing parties together. And I think that's the motive behind Qatar's being reliable international partners in resolving conflicts internationally, but more specifically in the context of our discussion today, Latin America.
Thank you very much. Let me move now to Brazil. We are on the cusp now of the signing of a very important deal between the European Union and Mercosur. President Lula of Brazil announced recently that this deal might be signed on the 20th of December. Brazil, of course, represents something like 40% of Latin America's GDP and 70% of the economy of the Mercosur countries, the others being Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay. But at the same time, regions remain fragile in Latin America, I believe. So when we're talking about cross-regional diplomacy, it obviously helps if the regions in question are already well-established and share common goals and common values. We in the European Union, of course, have a long experience of that, but I was wondering whether you believe that these kinds of cross-regional diplomacy efforts will strengthen intra-Latin American regional cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, in the region, we have a long tradition of trying to integrate. Therefore, there's a lot of institutions that not always have had the results that were expected, but there's a lot of convergence in a number of areas. And the experiences of cross-regional diplomacy have always been an instrument to reinforce that unity in a sense. Because we have, for instance, the CELAC, which is a group that puts together all Latin American countries. And we have had different occasions, for instance, CELAC EU meetings that have been important in order for both regions to create a dialogue and understand the similarities, the commonalities they have in a number of different areas. The same happens with the negotiation of the Mercosur-EU agreement. In different moments of this long yes. negotiation, it has been important for the Mercosur countries to have to get together, get their act together in order to be able to negotiate with the European Union. In some moments, it was even an instrument of cohesion within Mercosur, the fact that we needed to face that tough and difficult negotiation as well. So I think it has been very positive for the region, all kinds of inter-regional relations for the region as a whole, but also for Brazil as a country. Brazil has been trying to be more present everywhere. Mercosur has been trying to negotiate also agreements with the Gulf countries, have had some kinds of dialogue in that area as well. I think we, in a moment where the global situation is so fragile and unstable, it's important to create those linkages and to reinforce that kind of linkages. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Luis Alberto Castiglioni from Paraguay. It's often said that smaller states are very much in favor of minilateral arrangements because they have a bigger say than they would otherwise have in a broader multilateral context. I'm a bit embarrassed to describe Paraguay as a small country because, as Paul-Henri Spaak, the Belgian politician, once said, there are two kinds of states in Europe, small states and states that haven't realized that they're small. And perhaps this is true of Latin America as well. But specifically, could you tell us how a country like Paraguay deals with its relationships with much larger countries such as Brazil and indeed Argentina? Thank you.
Bueno. Buenos días.
Good morning. And please allow me, Charles, to please serve a recognition here to the Minister of State of Qatar, here in person, to himself, as well to the government of Your Highness, the Emir, because Qatar, with its conviction and faith in this multilateral action in a global manner in pandemic times, it approached its cooperation and solidarity with my country, with Paraguay, saving thousands of lives. So first of all, I would like to express my gratitude for everyone to know about this, and I would like to publicly say thank you to the Minister of Qatar. This is worth it because multilateralism entails solidarity and cooperation as well for its actions. Secondly, Paraguay counts on a long trajectory in particular actions to contribute to multilateralism, and this has happened for decades. And it's been one of the main drivers, alongside Brazil, for the creation of Mercosur, which is the common market of the South, that started as a mirror of the European Union, inspired by the success of this multilateral initiative that is the European Union. And that's how Mercosur was born, to make this multilateral integration a reality in Latin America. And through that, this has helped us to reinforce with our partners this institution. Within Mercosur, I would like to admit that we work with the concept of minilateralism. That is the reality, Charles. We work very well here with our brothers, which are Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, developing concrete actions with a great advantage. Because we're all close to each other, we are very alike, and we have a common vision from great values as democracy, the human being's dignity, the respect for human rights. Starting from these great values, we then land into particular objectives. And we work together in terms of security, for example, mentioning the security with the borders of Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina, where we deal with particular actions with countries, other countries as well. But also this is within the minilateralism framework. And also in terms of economy, right now we are developing the Bio-Oceanic Corridor, which has been denominated as the second Panama Canal, which unites the Atlantic with the Pacific Oceans and allows many regions from Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina through the ports of Chile to reach to the markets of the East, saving almost 21 days of traveling, which is 8,000 kilometers, saving a lot in logistics. This is how multilateralism works, with flexibility, with speed, with efficiency, with efficacy. And I believe this is how multilateralism needs to get to after the very needed reforms that might take place within its institutions for it to be again useful as it was in the past. Thank you very much.
Presents Uruguay, which is a country which has long been known for its commitment to multilateral organizations and practices. Uruguay has very often punched above its weight, I would argue. And I wanted to know from you whether you believe that the multilateral order is in terminal crisis. Is it simply going through a hiccup, shall we say, or do you think we are facing a turning point in international affairs? In other words, that business as usual will no longer work. And in connection with this, I was wondering, the Mercosur-EU negotiations have been going on for 25 years, which is quite an extraordinary amount of time. If Qatar had been involved, obviously, it would have been much less. How do you read this? And what lessons do you take away from Uruguay's long-standing historic commitment to the EU-Latin American relationship? Thank you.
Bueno, muy buenos días.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for this question, which is a complex question, which is quite the point in the days that we live in. These multilateralism institutions started when internet wasn't there, and the world we have today is very different from the world that arose after the Second World War. Geopolitics, commerce, trade, the Pacific, the Atlantic, everything has changed comparing to the world that we had right after the Second World War. Therefore, I believe that the consensus right now in the world, in a world dictated by uncertainty, is that multilateralism is going through a crisis. And I think that the main question here is, how do we interpret the crisis of the multilateralism, and which are the alternatives that we need to suggest, knowing that the institutions that represent multilateralism are not achieving to resolve the problems that the world has, the tensions that the world has. Currently, we have cross-state conflicts, and we have the biggest amount of conflicts since the Second World War, and we also have internal conflicts within the states. So definitely, this is a highly complex country. Uruguay is a small country, and we always go for Pacific conflict resolution, peaceful conflict resolution, and we always want to achieve our common target, which is to achieve the well-being of our societies. So yes, today we're living a world of tensions, but I believe that the reconstruction of the multilateral spaces is going to go towards not the solution of the reforms from the top, but most likely the group of regional spaces like Mercosur, CELAC, and the other spaces that deal with these friendship and cooperation relations, like, for example, the possibility that on the 20th of December we will sign a Mercosur and European Union agreement that is going to be very relevant. So I believe that the world complexity is the one that says that after 25 years of negotiations, we're finally managing to achieve this. All of this is an example of how our days are. So now, in order to build from something small, this would be the best path for the big solutions that the world needs. Usually when we build a building, we start with the foundations. And we're not able to solve everything from the top. But we need to use these regional agreements that are slowly building solutions and finding dialogues. Uruguay has been always betting for these spaces, these dialogue spaces, believing that if our grandparents were able, after in a critical moment, about the ability of the humans to destroy life and the planet, and they were able to build a path that achieved several decades of peace, I believe that now we should be able to look long-term, and we should be able to build a future, and we should look at this with optimism and hope. Thank you very much.
I wanted to ask Diego Martinez Belillo, who is what I call a thinking man's diplomat, because he's interested in academic and intellectual debates about diplomacy and international relations. Are you ever concerned that the rise of multilateralism might actually undermine larger multilateral structures? In other words, they may be more effective in the short term, they may deliver certain results which are badly needed, but isn't there a danger perhaps that the proliferation of minilateral agreements may actually weaken the multilateral order overall? I'm thinking, for example, of the World Trade Organization. Let me also ask you, since we may not have too much time for this later, Spain joined the European Union in 1986 and has always advocated stronger ties with Latin America. So if the Mercosur deal is signed, this would obviously be a great success for Spain as well as the EU as a whole. How easy is it, though, for Spain to remind our EU partners that Latin America is an absolutely crucial region of the world? Because, of course, nowadays everyone is obsessing with Ukraine, rightly so, of course. We are also deeply concerned about what's happening nearer to this part of the world in Gaza. So how easy is it for you to convince your German or your French colleagues that they should actually take the longer view and spend more time on Latin America? Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. I'm happy about this second part of the question, because I was thinking, reading the material for the panel, and we are here today in Qatar, and we are having a panel on Latin America. We have representatives from 3 continents. And I was thinking, are there panels like this in most European forums? Because I'm not so sure. Perhaps there are, but not so many. And we hear, I mean, I'm not availing myself of the opportunity, but we have a translation into Spanish, interpretation, which our European friends are very reluctant to grant in the European institutions, and because they're only thinking about Spain. And they're not thinking of what Spanish represents as a language in the world. So, and this was leading me, as I was hearing the other co-panelists, to think also of the way that when we raise these matters in the European Union, we have to raise them, I would say. Whereas when I speak with Qatari, and we have just finalized a very successful mediation with Colombia. And I think this speaks to the fact that we're here today, the mediation itself, to Qatar's far-sighted foreign policy and global foreign policy. And when I speak to, of course, our Qatari friends, friends from the Gulf, friends from Asia, Africa, Arab world, when they think of Spain, they automatically raise Latin America. They bring up Latin America matters, or they ask what we can do together in Latin America, or how we see things. And I have to say, this is something that seldom happens with European colleagues. And I think that's problematic, and it speaks to the lack of, or perhaps, as you said, Ukraine, but it's not only Ukraine. I think, of course, Ukraine has made these trends stronger, but sometimes one feels that Europe is becoming ever more self-centered, at the same time that the rest of the world is becoming ever more interconnected in both the positive ways and the negative ways. So I wouldn't say it's difficult, but it's something that we have to bring up first, like Mercosur, for instance. And I was discussing with our Brazilian friend about how in the European Council in, I think it was 2019, I myself, I was then at the Prime Minister's office, We brought the letter with 8 other countries, but it was promoted by Spain. Germany with Chancellor Merkel was on board as well, and this was the renewal for the political impulsion to the Mercosur deal. And you said 25 years for Mercosur, and I think that speaks volumes to the point where it even shows a certain lack, not only of interest, but almost of seriousness on our part. And now we have the signature on the 20th, so that's something of a Christmas gift for us, and I think it's also an important step for Europe. I think we are stepping up as well, but there are some trends that we need to change. On multilateralism, I think this is a broad term which includes two very different things, in fact. One is regional integration, and the other one is something which you can perhaps more identify like with international alignments. Two very different things. I think regional integration is in itself positive. I think there are few countries in the world which are as enthusiastic as Spain on regional integration in the European Union, but we've also supported it with our Latin American friends. In Africa, we are huge supporters of the African Union, of ECOWAS as well, and other integration processes. So I think those are inherently positive. We also have, of course, the Ibero-American community, and we'll be hosting the summit next year in Spain. So I don't think those are at all in contradiction. I think, on the contrary, in significant number of times, it can be favorable to the goals of multilateral organization. And what we see is that countries that are in regional integration processes are very often the same countries as Spain, which are 100% committed to multilateralism.
Thank you. Yes, you're quite right in underlining that it's probably quite rare to have a panel such as this in many international fora, and we're very grateful to Qatar for doing this. Minister, is there a sort of one-size-fits-all model for mediation and cross-regional diplomacy? Because we were discussing earlier, off the record, I don't want to get you in trouble, but you know, that the Swiss and the Norwegians, they seemed to have a one-size-fits-all approach, methodology, if you like, towards mediation and conflict resolution. And you were telling me earlier that the Swiss are now engaging with you because, to some extent, I think they want to understand why you are being successful where perhaps they no longer are. So my question is basically, what's the role of flexibility in all of this, and what's the role of personal leadership? Thank you.
Thank you so much. The simple answer, no. There is no one-size-fits-all. I think each case by itself has its own assessment and determination when it comes to the conflicts, the parties, the backgrounds, and the way and the approach the mediators would select in resolving those conflicts. Qatar has built up this experience. We have more than 25 years of experience in the field of mediation. We've been covering cases all over the globe with different parties and different backgrounds. Also different cultural backgrounds. I have an example in my mind, the Afghanistan-United States negotiations in Doha. Totally different cultural backgrounds, nations, that led to an agreement in 2020. This is something that is very critical for us, is trying to build the bridges. The mediator's role is simply to put the full attentions towards the case itself and trying to bring the parties together. It is the parties' duties to fulfill the agreements and to sustain that agreement in a longer period of time. When it comes to the points that you have raising related to the partners, we appreciate, honestly, the engagement that we're having with Norway, Switzerland, with Spain, and several other countries around the globe. We've signed several MOUs and letter of intents in the field of mediation. We believe, honestly, that today's conflict, one mediator cannot do it all. A group of mediators can be more efficient, more effective, and timely when it comes to resolving those conflicts in a determined period of time. Conflicts are always going to be there. And that's the fact that people need to realize. I remember the saying that peace is not the absence of conflict, but it's the ability to cope with it. We need to cope with conflicts in a way that will be very structured, with a clear methodology that will allow the mediators to perform their tasks. I've said that before and continue to say it. Mediation is contagious. One successful story will lead to other successful stories. And I believe that the momentum that we have created in Latin America has allowed more countries within that continent to knock the door of Qatar and engage with us more thoroughly towards those requests. Qatar will continue to fulfill that role. It's a constitutional mandate. And the approach, I think the unique approach that Qatar is following is that we keep our doors always open. We talk to all parties, state actors and non-state actors. And I've seen many of my colleagues around the globe, including Europeans, hesitant in getting engaged in many of the disputes due to the fact that some of the non-state actors are somehow difficult for those governments to approach them. For us, we believe that the ultimate objective is finding a permanent and sustainable solution. We believe that the ultimate objective is to secure an important humanitarian outcome. Many of the conflicts around the globe has its own catastrophe and a humanitarian impact. And this is something that Qatar strongly believes in, that the motive behind our work is purely humanitarian, and sometimes it comes at the cost of the mediator itself. And we've seen in several mediations where Qatar has lifted this heavy weight for the sake of achieving this ultimate objectives. We remain hopeful, we remain engaged with the different countries in Latin America, and we believe that the future will have further opportunities for Qatar and countries in Latin America.
Thank you very much. It's important to... Thank you. It's important to stress that success breeds success. We're running out of time, but I'd like all of you, gentlemen, to tell me in 2 words, 3 words perhaps, what the major consequences of the EU-Mercosur deal would be for your country and perhaps for the region generally. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the main effect of Mercosur-EU agreement would be to oxygenate the Brazilian economy. The Brazilian economy has traditionally been constituted under tariff protections and on the basis of the big market that we have in Brazil. And opening it to the European Union would oxygenate it, generate competition, generate innovation, and that would be to the benefit of the Brazilian population. One point which is important is that, contrary to what some Europeans think, agriculture is not going to be the big result for Brazil, because the agreement is an administrative trade agreement in the agricultural area. So in fact, in the end, probably EU will benefit more from the agreement in the agricultural area because it's a big exporter of processed products than Mercosur itself. It has been used as a political problem to make difficult the agreement to go forward. It has been a political problem, but it's not at all an economic problem for the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you. One of our analysts at the Elcano Royal Institute, who is a Uruguayan economist whom you know, Ernesto Talvi, he always stresses the fact that actually as a result of the signing of the agreement, tariffs between the Mercosur countries would practically disappear, and this would lead to a significant increase in inter-regional trade. Am I right?
Now, among Mercosur countries, they have already disappeared, except for sugar.
Some.
But it will certainly be an incentive for Mercosur industries to integrate more in order to export to Europe. I think that effect will also happen.
Thank you very much for that clarification. How about the Paraguayan view?
Well, correct.
It's going to have a very important impact, the signing of this agreement. Paraguay has even achieved the negotiation of some special conditions due to our very own condition of being a country that is landlocked. And consequently, we have achieved that 95% of the products that we are normally exporting to Europe are going to have 0 tariffs. And this grants us an enormous opportunity that will give us a great competitiveness in order to enlarge our markets. And at the same time, I would like to highlight something. We are going to be exporting food products, and we will also be exporting clean energies and fuels. But there's something very important that also entails an opportunity for Europe. Europe is going to have a space where they can invest in infrastructure, clean energy, and in many other areas of the economy that are going to have Europe as a destination. These are going to be investments in both sides and that are going to help develop both regions as it's required, because this is a win-win project. Both sides have to get benefit out of it. And I would even add something else. This is going to be the first model of an amplified market that has an interregional character from one continent to another. And it's going to compile 25% of our GDP. And I am sure is going to be replicated in other new models. This model is going to have a great success and is going to create a great number of new models of markets because of its success. Finally, Paraguay is also going to benefit from the transfer of technology by the modernization of its institutions, as, for example, in terms of intellectual property, public contracts, cybernetic security contracts. Our country is probably going to be one of the ones that gets the utmost benefit, but also Paraguay becomes completely open to offer all we have to offer in terms of opportunities for Europe, so they can make use of this agreement, so both America Latina, Mercosur, Europe can get benefit out of it and enlarge it to the rest of the world.
It can have systemic institutional consequences. What about the view from Uruguay? Are you optimistic? Are you sanguine about the consequences of an EU-Mercosur deal? How will you benefit?
Well, I think this is a great agreement. We have done a great deal of work unifying forces and hours of diplomatic human resources from both continents that we have been investing in terms of time to achieve this agreement. So we are obviously all very happy that this is materializing. And I do believe that it's going to have a great financial impact in the region and in Mercosur, because we're living in a world where disruption and technology changes, particularly Argentina and Mercosur, that are important food products producers, and they will continue to be for a long time. I think in this world, in the 90s, we were talking a lot about transforming the marketplace, but what we need to do now, particularly in Argentina, is to reconvert our companies. They need to look at international markets in a different way, incorporating science, technology, innovation, and the demands of the current world we live in, and that in a way that they allow to provide all of the advantages that Latin America has to offer, and allow us to open our markets more to the rest of the world. I think this is going to be a great opportunity and a great benefit for Mercosur. Additionally, the agreement between Mercosur and the EU, and it being reduced to simply a commercial agreement, does not match the reality that we live in. What we are building beyond a trade area and an area for cooperation, it's an area of shared values, values such as human rights, democracy, the resolution of controversies through talks and dialogue, and we're also building the defense of respect between nations and the search for peaceful resolutions of conflicts and dialogue. And I think this agreement between the EU and Mercosur also represents a political opportunity to show the chances the current world has to resolve conflicts in other ways. We do believe that production and commercial agreements are important, but this agreement also gives a further commitment to the rest of humanity.
Is that actually Europe, of course, we still regard as a normative power, and I know this is old-fashioned, but I'm sticking to my guns on this one. as Professor Ian Manners said many years ago, we are a normative power because we believe in norms, and therefore we also believe in a rules-based international order. But what you said about prosperity in the economy is very important as well. Hopefully this agreement will lead to equitable growth, sustainable growth, more inclusive growth, and not just economic growth at any price. Secretary of State, Minister Albaris likes to say that Latin America is the most Euro-compatible region in the world. Perhaps I would add that Europe is the most Latin America-compatible region in the world. I'm sure you wouldn't disagree with that. What systemic impact is this going to have right now, especially in the wake of Donald Trump's national security strategy, which people are hyperventilating about? You know, we need a breath of fresh air. We need a bit of hope. We need to restore our faith in cross-regional diplomacy and in multilateralism. Do you think the agreement will have this impact? Thank you.
Absolutely. And I would like, of course, this will be the largest trade agreement in the world, so that's very important in and of itself, and I think the economic impact has been stressed by everyone. I would like to also stress the value aspect, and why is Latin America Euro-compatible or Europe Latin America compatible? I think it's probably Europe is not as conscious of being compatible with Latin America as the other way around, and I think this agreement will help change that perception. It will help through the creation of economic bonds, which in fact always imply human ties, will help anchor the relationship between Europe and Latin America. That's something we've pushed during our presidency. We had the first EU-CELAC summit in 8 years. We established periodic summits, also a follow-up mechanism on ministries. I think it's also, that's I think the main result, and as a diplomat I like to think in more in political terms, and these trade ties will bring human ties, and that means political capital and attention as well. And I think it's also, and now I'm thinking more selfishly as a Spaniard and European, it's a symbol of the European Union really taking itself seriously, itself and the words that we say, in a way putting our money where our mouth is, and saying that, you know, when we say we want to be a strategic power, we want to be a power for norms and order in the world, that we are finally stepping up our game and we are getting important things done.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. We've actually finished on time, which is a miracle whenever I'm a moderator. We have 35 seconds to go. So let me just conclude by asking you all to thank our speakers. Many of them have come a long way to be here with you today, and of course the Minister for his inspiring leadership. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charles, for sticking to the time, for keeping us on track, and thank you for this fascinating conversation. So many fresh perspectives, interesting voices from Latin America and the Middle East, highlighting the role that smaller and emerging actors can play when they work together to reimagine and recreate important aspects of the global order through their, well, new approach to mediation and diplomacy, how to build trust and offer innovative pathways to peaceful resolution in conflicts, and, crucially, how to offer a much-needed alternative to the Western-led international order. Much to think about and reflect on. Please don't go too far. We're going to change the set very quickly for a change of gears as we get ready for our next session. We'll be back in just a few minutes.
Nagtitesting ako, handheld 3. One, two, hello, sound check, test. Check, check, test. 1, 2, hello, sound check.
Ladies and gentlemen, can I ask you to please take your seats as we begin our next session? Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats so that we can begin. Now, our next speaker really needs no introduction, but I'm delighted to give her one anyway. She served as First Lady, United States Senator, and Secretary of State, but to many she remains the woman who came closer than anyone else before her to breaking the ultimate and highest barrier in American politics. If you'll forgive the reminder, Madam Secretary. She is a leader who has shattered glass ceilings, endured a level of scrutiny that very few public figures have ever had to face. She has met every challenge with unwavering resilience, which has become her trademark. She brings experience and decades of leadership in diplomacy and global development. And it is my pleasure to welcome to the stage Hillary Clinton and Foreign Policy's Ravi Agrawal for this one-on-one conversation.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Ravi Agrawal. I'm the editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy magazine and the host of FP Live. We are here today for a special taping of a show called Counterpoint, which FP hosts in partnership with the Doha Forum. And so I'm just going to ask you all to make sure that you have your phones on silent. This is a recording. And before we start off, I'm going to ask for one more proper warm round of applause for our guest, Hillary Clinton, please. There you go. That's more like it. And now we can start. Secretary Clinton, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Ravi.
So let's start with something in the news. The Trump administration just dropped its national security strategy. What do you make of it?
Well, I think it's fair to say that I'm still digesting it. There is a very clear message from the strategy that was issued that the United States is taking a very big turn away from the kind of alliances that have been the hallmark of our foreign policy, and I would argue our real strength in influencing events in the world. So if you look at it, there's a very strong indictment of Europe, and in particular, the openness of Europe and the composition of the population of Europe. And that, to me, is an unnecessary division between us and countries with whom we have a lot in common and a lot that is necessary to our security. The sort of updating of the Monroe Doctrine that goes back to a very early president of ours, James Monroe, about dominating the Western Hemisphere, is something that is going to be very difficult to pull off, and we're watching the administration with its buildup of military power and its use in the region, and wondering, where that will lead. But in general, it raises more questions than answers about what actually will be done to implement these kind of very broad statements that are found in the strategy.
So if a lot of that is in theory, let's just talk about what we've seen so far in the last 11 months. When you look around the world, what is your sense of the impact Trump has had on his second term on countries around the world?
Well, personally, I'm quite concerned about the impact because there has been a very heavy emphasis on moving away from what I think are core American values in a number of ways. And that's not to say that there haven't been some successes.
Can you describe those values? What do you mean by that?
Well, for example, supporting Russia's invasion of Ukraine, both in an affirmative way by very rarely criticizing Putin for the brutal war that he has waged on the Ukrainian people, and then, attempting to try to coerce the Ukrainians into accepting a negotiated ceasefire and peace deal that would be, by any objective measure, leaving them vulnerable to further Russian activity. Remember, Russia has been in Ukraine since 2014, so this didn't start in 2022. So I think that there's a lot that needs to be reviewed and looked at from the perspective of what are the long-term consequences. And I just find that very often it's difficult to wrap your arms around, what is the objective? If it is to cause disruption and hope that that will lead to a better outcome, I've seen a lot of disruption, but we're still not yet at the point where we see what the actual effects will be. So take a couple of quick things. I very quickly supported the 20-point peace plan to bring about the Gaza ceasefire and gave, the president and his people credit for getting that terrible war to finally end. But it's a 20-point peace plan that takes an enormous amount of work and effort and diplomacy and negotiation and carrots and sticks to make sure you get all the parties around the table and try to figure out how to move forward with it. that's where we'll really find out if that is going to stick. I already mentioned Ukraine. I think it's a terrible position for the United States to be in. You know, I was thinking 35 years ago, another dictator invaded a neighbor, namely Saddam Hussein, you know, crossed the border to seize parts of Kuwait. And the world rightly reacted, because you cannot reward that kind of aggression where efforts are made to literally, you know, invade your neighbor and seize territory, claiming that, you know, by some, you know, theory it belongs to you. So the world reacted. Saddam Hussein was, you know, obviously pushed back. In this situation, you know, Putin is intent upon taking as much of Ukraine as he can. I think we could have played, both in the Biden administration and now in the Trump administration, a much more assertive role in trying to help Ukraine continue to do the very heroic job it's doing defending itself. With China, if you look at the national security strategy, there's a lot of, you know, very important points about economic competition. And we also, though, have to recognize that along with the economic competition, there's a strategic competition with China in the region. And the buildup of the Chinese military assets are, you know, ones that pose a direct threat. First, foremost to our allies in the region, but then also to the United States. So, you know, when you look at diplomacy of any kind, whether it's trying to end a war or trying to prevent a war, or deter your adversaries, there has to be so much follow-up. And there is an aversion within the administration to, you know, the kind of work that is done by foreign service officers, diplomats, others who are on the front lines trying to fulfill these national security objectives. And there's a very small group around the president who he trusts to do all of this. And I think in many ways that is just not adequate for the complexity of the problems we face.
You know, but part of the criticism that the Trump administration has often had, say, for example, of the Obama administration or even the Biden administration, was that there was too much of all of that stuff. And so they claim that they right-sized the China strategy, which was a direct critique of the Obama years. And in a sense, there's bipartisan agreement in the United States. I'm not saying that's right, but there is. That we needed a different approach to China.
Look, I think that there's a lot to critique in any presidential administration. But I think that there's also a lot to learn from any presidential administration about what works and what doesn't work. You know, for example, I recently saw an analysis of peace agreements, which ones actually stick and how you get to them. And, you know, obviously in the 90s, there was the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, there was the Dayton Agreement in the Balkans. And so I know how much effort went into actually getting those agreements made. And in the case of Northern Ireland and in the case of the Balkans, what it took to demilitarize, decommission the weapons of the combatants, all of that, that is the boring, hard work of actually achieving diplomatic success. And I think there's a lot to be said for the kind of dramatic and bold action that we see from this president, but that standing alone is not sufficient. It may be necessary to get the world's attention, get the party's attention, get something done in the immediate effort to show progress, but then you've got to do all of that hard work. So it's not either or. You know, when I think about the kinds of diplomacy that I saw, you know, in the 90s, that I saw when I was in the Senate, that I was part of in the Obama administration, there are a lot of tools in the toolkit. And among those tools are soft power, development, which we have unfortunately decided is not going to be a prominent tool in how we try to, you know, influence people, persuade them. China's filling that gap, particularly in Africa. So it's you know, to me, you don't get into office and say everything that was ever done going back to the founding of the country was wrong and we're going to, you know, do it differently. You say hey, I've got a different style, I've got some different ideas, I'm going to learn from the past, I'm going to apply what works, and then we're going to go from there. That just makes sense to me, and I worry that we are, you know, shutting a lot of doors, cutting off a lot of our allies, and not learning some of those lessons right now.
So I'm going to come back to Trump and also the future of the Democratic Party. I want to talk about you now. You've been in the news this past week for some comments you made at an event in New York organized by the newspaper Israel Hayom. And I'm going to paraphrase here, but you said that smart, well-educated young Americans are getting their news from social media and from TikTok. And you went on to say that this is how they're learning about what happened on October 7th and then what happened in Gaza in the months that followed. And it appears that this was a broader lament on your part about declining support among Americans for Israel. That comment has generated a lot of controversy, and it's led Congressman Ro Khanna, for example, to point out that I don't think the answer is to disparage the intelligence of young people. It's been a few days now since you've said that. How are you reflecting on your words and the controversy around it?
Well, I think it is a provable fact that most Americans and an even bigger percentage of young Americans get their news from social media. If that is controversial, then people are not paying attention to how...
Is that a bad thing?
I don't know if it's a bad thing, but I think it's an incomplete...
Well, let me rephrase this.
They should be listening to you, Ravi. I mean, obviously.
People do listen to me for what it's worth, and I am also on Instagram and TikTok. But I guess the broader point here is that if Americans are shifting in their views about Israel, and poll after poll shows that that is the case, that is based on some information that they're getting not just from social media, but also from very reputable journalists operating in the region, also Palestinian journalists in Gaza. Why is that not accurate?
I'm not saying it's not accurate. I am saying that I teach at Columbia University, and I teach a course called Inside the Situation Room. And so it's a very large course. I co-teach it with the dean of the School of International and Public Affairs. And so I've had many, many conversations with very smart young people, not just Americans, but literally from around the world.
It's worth pointing out that Columbia, of course, has been a center of some protest and action
and it was.
On this issue.
And I talked to students there. I've talked to students elsewhere. And in talking with them about their views, they were certainly entitled to those views based on whatever information they had. But they did not always know why they were saying what they said. And all I'm asking for is that people have a historical context, both for what has happened to the Palestinians and what has happened to the Israelis, because we are not going to implement the 20-point peace plan or any other peace plan unless people come with some sense of historical perspective and empathy about how we're going to move people toward what I still believe is the only realistic outcome, a two-state solution. And we're not going to get there if people, when they say from the river to the sea, and you say what river and what sea, and they don't know, which has personally happened in conversations that I've had. I just, but this is a larger issue, because even on other matters in this class that I teach, we are not doing a good job teaching history. We're not giving young people the kind of context that I think they need to be decision makers.
But with all due respect, and I can't gauge how well young people grapple with history, but what I can speak to is they're grappling with the here and now. And they are witnessing images that are live streamed, that are coming out every day. And yes, there is misinformation and disinformation, but a lot of it is real. And I think there's a genuine anger in the United States and around the world that some of that anger is deflected.
But Ravi, I'm angry about all of the human rights abuses. I'm angry about all of the excessive use of force. I'm angry about, what happened on October 7th in Israel and what happened in Gaza. I'm angry about what Russia's doing in Ukraine. I'm angry about Sudan. I'm angry about the Eastern Congo. I mean, I think we should be all looking at the tragedies and the conflicts that are bringing about so much suffering and be dealing with them. That's why the national security strategy is not to my liking, because I think the United States has an important role in trying to resolve these conflicts and alleviate the suffering and give people a chance to have peaceful, prosperous lives. That should be our goal. That is in America's interest. I don't care where in the world you are. So, of course, the suffering in Gaza is horrific. Full stop. Suffering everywhere is horrific. So let's look at what we can do to try to resolve, what is being done to people in so many different settings right now. And I think that the emphasis on one terrible conflict sort of doesn't do justice to the challenges that we are confronting. And I don't want to see my country basically say, you know what, those other presidents, they tried to resolve conflicts. They tried to stand for democracy and freedom. They stood up for human rights. What a waste of time. That is, to me, an abdication of leadership. And I want to see us involved everywhere, trying to stop the kind of horrible abuses that are going on.
I'm with you in all of that. I think the argument we often hear, of course, is that America has a different role in the Middle East. Of course, it supports Israel and therefore is complicit to a degree. But I want to draw a line from all of this to 9/11 and America's misadventures after 9/11 and the war in Iraq, the war on terror. And one could make the case that at some level, America's been unable to maybe curb Israel in this particular case, or even impose its will and talk about values and rules and norms and conflicts around the world, in part because it too has skirted rules and norms in several instances in its history. Is it your sense now that we're entering a world where the rules and norms don't matter as much? And what can the United States do?
Look, I think it's an interesting analogy, because when a country is attacked, and as you know, I was a senator from New York on 9/11, so I was deeply involved in dealing with families who had lost loved ones, dealing with the people who had been grievously injured, dealing with the horrible cleanup and everything we had to do in Lower Manhattan. That is a traumatic event. And people don't always make the best decisions post-traumatic events. You have to understand that. And I'm not sure that, that was well understood after 9/11 in American decision-making. And I think you can see other examples of that, obviously. That's part of the reason why we established all of these norms and laws after the Second World War. When you talk about how the rule of law, how the expectations of militaries in combat are supposed to be judged, all of that was an effort to try to construct a system that could rein in bad leaders like Vladimir Putin, who wants to dominate and destroy his neighbors, leaders who are traumatized by horrific events and therefore lash out and may not be, restrained and acting the way that they should. That's part of why we constructed this whole system, to move away from norms and laws in the international system will only benefit the worst actors in the international system, whether they are heads of state or criminal cartels or whoever. So I really believe it's a mistake for the United States not to be upholding all those rules. Does that mean we're always going to follow them perfectly? No, nobody ever has. But we need not just to give lip service to them, but to try our best to set examples, to be a nation of laws, not men, as the saying goes. And the world will be much worse off if the United States retreats from that position. Now, we have a big dispute going on right now over the bombing of these fishing boats.
Off the coast of Venezuela.
Yeah, in the Caribbean and the Pacific, and there has not been an adequate showing. I was on the Senate Armed Services Committee, and the Bush administration, which I did not always agree with, we would require them to come up and explain things and provide information. In the Obama administration, even in the most secret negotiation in the Situation Room I was ever involved in, the decision to go after Osama bin Laden, the leaders of Congress were briefed on that. So there were norms, there were rules, there were, both legal and kind of moral expectations.
I have to ask, I'm sure you get asked this all the time, where is Congress today?
Well, the Congress has abdicated its responsibility, and it's very sad to me because no president likes to be questioned by the Congress. I don't care what party you are. But that's part of the way our system was set up under our Constitution. The Congress is supposed to serve as a check on the executive power, and I think it's unfortunate that they have failed to do that. And basically, it's the Republican Party that doesn't want to, in any way, hold the administration accountable. That is not in keeping with our Constitution, and it is not smart because presidents need to be held accountable. It's a heady feeling, being in the Oval Office. And part of the way our founders, and we're about to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, understood human nature was to say, hey, look, there have to be separation of powers, there have to be checks and balances. The first article sets up the Congress, the second the executive, the third the judiciary. And there's supposed to be all of this tension so that nobody goes too far and leads the country astray. So I think the Congress has abdicated
what about
that responsibility.
Democrats? Could Democrats be doing more, and are you advising them in any capacity to try and come up with a better strategy?
Well, look, I think the Democrats actually came out of that shutdown in a strong position because they put affordability, particularly the affordability of health care, front and center on the domestic agenda. It was very hard to get any kind of, smart political strategy in the beginning because the Democrats had so few tools. But I think that there is a growing awareness that the Democrats are being more effective in their opposition to the president. And I think the recent elections prove that voters are beginning to ask a lot of questions. Obviously, you can look at polling and favorability ratings and all of that. But what bothers me is that I was in the Senate for 8 years. I know a number of the Republicans who are still in the Senate. I don't recognize them because they were more than happy to criticize and question Bush and certainly Obama and certainly Biden. And they, they are either intimidated or in agreement, whatever the reason might be, that they're not doing the same now.
When you look at why Democrats lost to Trump, what do you think in general they're missing about where the country is at? What have they gotten wrong? What are they misreading?
Well, look, I think that we are about to see political changes come and go, as you know so well. And I think that there were a lot of missed signals in the Biden administration. Obviously, Democrats lost the presidential election. I think there was a lot of uncertainty about how best to take on the president in the initial months of this term. But I think they have found their footing, and I think the candidates who are running, whether it's the new mayor-elect in New York, who made affordability the center of his campaign, or the newly elected governors in New Jersey and Virginia, who also made affordability the key message of their campaigns, that is beginning to resonate because it reflects the reality of Americans' daily lives. You know, President Trump ran on affordability in large measure. You know, I'm going to get the prices down, you're going to have a better economic future. That hasn't happened. And so you can only tell people something for so long before they say, wait a minute, because that's what happened with Biden. He kept saying, you know, the economic indicators are really good, and people are saying, yeah, I'm looking at my grocery list, and I can't afford half the items on it. I'm looking at my electricity rates. I'm looking at my health care costs. And so they turned on Biden, even though, you know, he had tried very hard to lay the groundwork for new jobs and all the rest of it. Now you see people turning on the president. You see his favorabilities, you know, in the 30s in some polls. Why? Because their lived reality does not reflect the messages that are being put out from the White House. And I think there are concerns, you know, about what some of the other actions are. You know, one of the things that really broke through to people was demolishing the East Wing of the White House. And, you know, look, you can have an argument the White House needs a big space for people to gather, that's fine. But it was just such an abrupt decision, and the pictures were so incredibly disturbing. So people all of a sudden started saying, wait a minute, what's going on? That's the White House. So there's a lot that is beginning to penetrate, not just among Democrats, but independents as well, about, wait a minute, maybe this is not exactly what I voted for.
Last question. 30 years ago, you went to Beijing and you gave this iconic speech in which you said women's rights are human rights. And in many senses, I mean, that opened so many doors around the world and, you know, was formative in creating a feminist foreign policy. There have been some reversals of all the gains in the last 3 decades to the last few years. They're disappointing. I know you're not despondent, though. What gives you hope on this?
Well, specifically on this issue, you know, 30 years ago, I did make a speech, but what was more significant is that 189 countries reached consensus on something called the Platform for Action, which was the most historic effort to lay out all the ways in which women were not being treated equally and fairly in societies around the globe. And we made a lot of progress. For example, domestic violence was not considered a crime. It was a norm. It was like, oh, well, that's what happens in families. And that was changed. And all of a sudden, countries began to pass laws against domestic violence and train judges and law enforcement people to deal with it. Child marriage was seen as, you know, a norm that, you know, really cut into a young woman's potential for her own life, her education and her health, and so much else. So on so many grounds, we were making all this progress, and women across the globe were advancing toward a greater sense of opportunity. And there has been a reversal. Started in COVID with real intention, in part because economically a lot of families found themselves in terrible trouble. And so child marriage started going up, domestic violence started going up again. And what I'm seeing now is that even in countries that are, you know, advanced economies, there are a lot of doors shutting. I mean, it's a very sad commentary that there is now a lot of corporations that are saying, well, wait a minute, I don't want to get in trouble if I put a woman on the board, even though I'd like to hear from a woman. You know, I ended up on the Walmart board because Sam Walton called me and said, I think I need a woman on the board because, you know, most of my customers are women, and we don't have any women, and I want to know what women think when they go into my store. Well, that was common sense. That was not revolutionary. That wasn't DEI. That was like, we have a big market out there. We want to sell to everybody, and that includes women and people of color and everybody else. So I just see that there's a very real pushback in ways that are endangering women's lives, cutting back on health care, child marriage, once again, being, you know, an economic necessity, what the Taliban is doing. you know, the continuing campaign against women with forced hijab in Iran, but also in Hungary, in Russia, in Turkey, turning back laws that were meant to protect women. Xi Jinping saying, I wish more women would go back into the home because we need more children. Well, they need more children because they had the one-child policy, and they have a 30 million male surplus because they didn't keep their baby girls alive because they could only have one child. I mean, all of these decisions have consequences, and authoritarianism often picks on women first because they're more vulnerable and they can be you know, pointed to as the problems in society or because of what women are doing or failing to do. So there has been pushback and there are reversals, but I am optimistic because I think that is out of step with reality. And I still believe that women's rights are human rights and that women's equality is the unfinished business of the 21st century. And every nation will do better the more they give opportunities for women to make their own decisions.
That's a great place to end. Secretary Clinton, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Clinton. Thank you, Ravi, for this interesting discussion. Not always easy to be in the hot seat. Secretary Clinton taking many of the questions that so many of us here in this room wanted to hear about surrounding US foreign policy and some of the negative perceptions surrounding it, as well as so many other issues that Secretary Clinton also addressed. Now we're going to just pause for a very brief few moments while we wait for our next speaker to arrive. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, can I please ask you to take your seats as we begin our next session. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats so we can begin. All right, we're almost there. I can still see quite a few people standing, so please, if you can hear me, please take your seats. All right. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to now introduce our next speaker. He's a leader whose vision and steady diplomacy have guided his nation through some of its recent challenges. He has a remarkable ability to turn tense and complex situations into diplomatic breakthroughs. From the release of hostages to helping broker ceasefires, he does it all while keeping a level of calm that most of us can only dream of. He does it with humility, with skill, and with clarity. And if you've observed him long enough, as I have, you'll know that he never gives much away. In fact, he gives nothing away, which is probably why he is a brilliant negotiator and probably also someone you would not want to take up for a game of poker. And he does it all with an effortless ease. Please join me in welcoming the Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs of the State of Qatar, His Excellency Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdurrahman bin Jassim Al Thani, and Tucker Carlson.
Thank you, Sheikh Mohammed, for doing this. Have you been reading the coverage on American social media of this?
Well, actually, I've been going through some of them this morning, and I saw like a lot of contradicting messages.
Pretty intense, I'd say. This country's being denounced as a terror state, terror financing, very high volume, lots of attacks, including from politicians, sitting U.S. senators, Ted Cruz, for example. And the main criticism seems to revolve around Hamas, and the idea is that your country, and you specifically, are supporters of Hamas, you're terror financiers. And I'd like to just get right to the truth of that. So my understanding is Hamas is here in Doha because the United States and Israel asked you to host Hamas. Is that true? And if not, what is the truth about Hamas in Doha?
Well, thank you, Tucker. First of all, look, the starting of the relationship with Hamas and the communication was started back more than 10 years, 13 years ago, at the request of the United States. Even beyond that, like it was 19 years ago when they first participated in the election, and then when they moved their office back in 2012 here, it was used only for the communication and to facilitate like ceasefire, facilitating aids to Gaza. Now, unfortunately, Qatar has been attacked for having them here, but when you look, at what's happening within the region, this region, when you look at its conflict, it has the parties of the conflict, sometimes they are state actors, sometimes they are non-state actors. If you have no one speaking to those non-state actors, how we are going to resolve or to reach to a solution at the end of the day? And now we have seen that this communication has led to ceasefires, has led to the release of the hostages, has led to alleviating the suffering of the people over there. And unfortunately, there are like politicians who are trying to use this to score like short-term political gains to fuel their narratives in order to using Qatar to blame another country for what's happening over there or for their wrong policies. All our aid and all our support and financing that went and what they claimed that it went to Hamas, went to Gaza, went to the people, and it was under very transparent process that the United States is fully aware about. Israel is the one who's facilitating, and it's not one government, it was across governments. Netanyahu, Bennett, we have dealt with all the agencies. Lapid was a prime minister at a certain point of time, Mossad, Shin Bet, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, all of and the defense, all of them, they were involved in these aids and the delivery of those aids. So today, when they are claiming that this is the financing of Qatar to Hamas, it has no basis. It's just a way to spread this information about a country that doesn't do anything for them, but it's doing things that are against their policies. If you just go to Qatar records with in its engagement with the United States for the last 20 years or 30 years, Qatar has never went to the United States and encouraging them to bomb this country or to support this group or to that group. We've been always in our dialogues with the United States about how we de-escalate the region, how we bring peace to the region, and this peace cannot happen without an engagement with everyone in the region.
Well, I'm confused then. If you hosted Hamas here and sent money to Gaza, both of those things at the request of the US government and the Israeli government, successive Israeli governments, why did Israel bomb your country?
Well, it's, I don't know if there is, I don't know if, if any of the actions that's been, or many of the actions that's been taken, been justified or rationalized or even were ethical actions. But in principle, even you have a mediator, the concept of mediation is like a safe place for the conflicted parties to achieve a deal, to end wars and to end conflicts, and to have the mediator being bombed by one of the parties of the conflict. This has been unprecedented, and I have said that many times, that this is, it's not only an unethical move, it's just, throwing everything against the wall, throwing the international law, throwing the respect of the sovereignty of any other country. Besides, ethically, it's not really acceptable, or no one can swallow it.
No, and the aftermath was also unprecedented. So President Trump basically told the Israelis to apologize to you. He took your side. He took the side of an Arab country against Israel in this specific case. I don't think I've ever seen that before. I don't think it's ever happened before. What was your reaction to that?
Well, of course, President Trump was very clear from the beginning since the attack. Actually, when he was informed about the attack, he assigned one of his advisors to reach out to us, and at the same time, he called His Highness after the attack, and he expressed his frustration, his disappointment from such a thing that's happening by Israel, because he knows everything about the process and he knows how helpful we were throughout this process. And you know, this kind of move was shocking for him as you know, a partner in these efforts, in these endeavors to achieve peace in Gaza. And at that time, actually, when the strike happened, it was happening while we were trying to convince Hamas to accept the offer was made by President Trump at that time, to convince them to engage, to convince them to get a deal before the 20 points being developed when the attack happened.
So you're saying that President Trump was surprised by the bombing of Doha by the Israelis. Of course, it was his peace process that was short-circuited by their bombing using American money. You're saying that the president didn't know that was going to happen. He was surprised.
He called us right away. His advisors who reached out to us, they reached out to us just a couple of minutes before the attack, which was like the attack was already happening. So it was very clear demonstration with all the actions that this is something happened against his will, and he doesn't accept it. And he made it very clear for everyone that this is like a red line, that he doesn't want anyone to cross it, and we highly value that and appreciate it.
And I'm just pressing you on this because there were news accounts in the subsequent days, the next day, the day after, in Israel saying, no, the Israeli government did this, the prime minister did this, with the agreement of Donald Trump. This was part of Donald Trump's plan, was to bomb Doha, bomb his own peace negotiations, and you're saying that's not true.
Well, I think this is one of many efforts to sabotage the relationship between Qatar and the United States, and they want us to believe that. And I think that you know, these efforts are not new to us. We have seen a lot of efforts ongoing for years now on, you know, based on disinformation and spreading lies and false information about Qatar in order to hurt the relationship between Qatar and the United States, which we see it from our perspective as mutually beneficial for both countries. Because we advocate for something different than what, you know, our adversaries advocate. Our adversaries advocating for escalation, for bombing, for controlling, but we advocate for resolving conflict in a diplomatic way, trying to stabilize the region, and that has been Qatar policy since inception.
So you said that your country has sent money to Gaza for humanitarian reasons. That's your position. Basically paying to help the people who are being bombed by Israel. Now there's the question of who rebuilds Gaza, which has of course been completely destroyed, and who pays for it. And I wonder, well, I don't wonder, I just imagine with total certainty that you will be asked to pay for the rebuilding of Gaza. Why would you do that? Why would you rebuild a region that's been destroyed by a country that also bombed you?
Well, look, Tucker, here, you know, there is like a very, say, like an ironic situation when you look at like two conflicts happening at the same time, and you are hearing like many about when it comes to the Russia-Ukrainian conflict, that Russia should fund all the reconstruction and their assets should be seized to fund all the reconstruction of Ukraine, while when you are talking about Gaza and Israel, you know, flattened this land, and you say that Israel has the responsibility to rebuild what it's destroyed, they will tell you no, you will have, as a region, you will have the responsibility to do so. And it's really very ironic double standards when you look at it. From our side, as a state of Qatar, we will continue supporting the Palestinian people. We will do whatever to alleviate their suffering, but we are not the ones who are going to write the check to rebuild what others destroys. That's basically our position. But also we will not let the Palestinian people at dry if they are not helped or they are not funded.
I should say from an American perspective, it's even more grotesque. So you are asked to pay for the destruction and for the rebuilding. This is like, yeah, it's a little much. So, but you're saying clearly that your country will not pay to rebuild what Israel destroyed.
That's our position. Our position is that our payments will go only to help the Palestinian people if we see that the help is coming to them is insufficient. That's basically our position.
What happens to the current residents of Gaza? Do they stay in Gaza? I know there's an effort to find some other country to send them to, either in Asia or Sudan or Milwaukee. But do they stay in Gaza?
Well, I think that, you know, when it's hurting us when we hear people talking about the people of Gaza as like, you know, some sort of different people, because like they have the right to have the choice where to live. And they don't want to, you know, to leave their country. And we have seen these demonstrations like in many occasions when we see the opening between the south and the north of Gaza. We see the mass return of the people to their homes, even if their homes is flattened and gone. They just go there and build a tent. And this is just showing you how solid are those people, how resilient are those people, how those people, they don't want to leave the land that they belong to. And I don't see anyone has the right to deport them or to force them to go somewhere else. It's their country, it's their home, and they have all the right to stay there and to live there.
Yeah, the idea of moving millions of people by force into another country, you know, has been discredited, I would say, historically. Big picture, this is a question that remains unanswered in the United States. Like, what is the plan here exactly in the Levant? What is Israel's plan? What is the strategy? I understand it's, you know, defeating Hamas and Hezbollah, and, you know, I understand the short-term goals that are often articulated, but what does this look like in 10 years? What is the object? Do you have any idea?
Well, I think, you know, if we look at the situation currently, I have mentioned that yesterday. The situation currently is not is not something that can survive for long in being stable. Now, the issue that if the Israeli forces remains there, if the violations remains happening in Gaza, this conflict can escalate again. And that's what all of us, we want to avoid. The best plan is to apply what's been already agreed on in the plan that President Trump has launched and the countries in the region has supported, to rebuild Gaza for the Gazan people to remain there, but also finding a political solution for the bigger issue, because if you keep this issue unresolved, the Palestinian issue unresolved, you know, things will escalate again and again. We cannot build a house without building the foundation of that house. And the foundation of that house, that the Palestinian people get their rights for their states, and they have the right to stay in their own land.
From an outside perspective, it seems like the prospect of, you know, full rights internally or a separate and autonomous Palestinian state, those seem like more remote than ever. That seems less likely than ever to happen, but maybe I'm reading it wrong.
Well, unfortunately, you know, peace needs, you know, a partner also for that. With the current configuration in Israel and what we are seeing in the political landscape there in the Knesset and all those resolutions that they are passing against the two-state solution is just, you know, setting us apart from this path, which is unfortunate to see that there is no enforcement to push them that this is the only path forward to have a two-state solution. We cannot, you know, remain hostage to the far right and the extremist agenda to ethnically cleanse the Palestinian or to kick them out of their lands. And what we are looking for two countries, two people living side by side peacefully and being part of the region. And that's what the entire region is aspiring for.
It is widely believed in Washington that Israel will initiate another war against Iran in this coming year, 2026. I don't know if that's true. Do you believe it is true?
Well, let's hope not. I think that it's very important to try to find a way to reactivate the talks on the nuclears and to see a track of diplomacy, because right now what we are seeing, there is an absence of any efforts in resolving the issue diplomatically. And as we have mentioned many times, that anything would happen to Iran, it will have its impact on the entire region, on the entire Gulf region. Qatar, Saudi, Bahrain, Kuwait, UAE, all the countries will be affected with such a thing. And I hope not, but there is a lot of uncertainty of what's happening in the region right now. We see Lebanon bombing is continuing while what supposedly the war has ended. We see Gaza bombing is still continuing while there is a ceasefire is ongoing. So it all depends on how can we make sure that Israel stops at this level and doesn't escalate further.
One of the reasons I openly admire you despite much criticism and was grateful to interview you today is because your country acts as a kind of neutral zone around the world, not just in your region. Switzerland no longer being non-aligned, unfortunately, it's fallen to your country to be the place where people can negotiate conflicts to peace, settlement. You're doing that in Eastern Europe with Russia, Ukraine. You helped get Evan Gershkovich out of prison in Russia. I don't know if you've gotten credit for that. God bless you for doing that. Do you see that conflict as moving toward resolution?
Well, I think that there are a lot of hope in the current endeavor that's carried out by the United States to reach to a resolution, because I believe that this war has becoming very disruptive, not only for Europe and not only for the Ukrainians, becoming disruptive for the entire world, and it's just polarizing the world more and more. And this is not in anyone's interest, and it will have its consequences. Right now, we see relentless efforts by the U.S. administration in order to achieve a deal, and the Ukrainians are engaging in this process, and we are trying our best also whenever we are needed to help and to support within that process. But I believe it is solvable. It can be achieved. It's not something impossible.
So last question. I've been personally, not to make it about me, but I have been criticized as being a tool of Qatar. And I just want to say what you already know, which is I've never taken anything from your country and don't plan to. I am, however, tomorrow buying a place in Qatar, both because I am.
Please pay a high check.
In Doha, yeah. And I'm doing that because I like the city. I think it's beautiful. But also to make the statement that I'm an American and a free man, and I'll be wherever I want to be, which I think is important. But that does kind of leave us in a place where I have not taken any money from Qatar. I have instead given money to Qatar. And I wonder if you feel that that means I've bought you and you will now spew my propaganda.
Well, thank you. Just ask me whatever you want me to do for you, I will do it. But look, Tucker, unfortunately, as I told you, that there are a lot of players putting a lot of efforts to sabotage the relationship between Qatar and the United States and to try to demonize anyone who will come to this country. Our efforts, when we are lobbying or doing our outreach in the United States, is to make sure that this relationship is safeguarded. And the relationship for us is mutually beneficial. We are not getting aid from the United States. Instead, we are buying from the United States. We are partnering with them. We are investing in the United States investing in Qatar. And this relationship has been always a two-way relationship. And we pay all these amounts for lobbying only to protect and to safeguard this relationship. If we were not being attacked and under a lot of disinformation campaign that's been unfortunately funded by other players who doesn't want to see a U.S.-Qatar relationship flourish, we would spend this money for better things, to do with the relationship.
Sheikh Mohammed, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Sheikh Mohammed. Thank you, Tucker, for this very insightful interview and for this refreshing rebalancing of American perspective toward the Middle East region, particularly Qatar, which, despite all of its diplomatic successes and successful mediation, still manages to get a bad rep in the United States. We are going to be just 1 second here before we resume. Can I please? Yalda. Ladies and gentlemen, can I please ask you to take your seats once again as we go straight into our next session. Ladies and gentlemen, please do take your seats. All right, we're going to begin. Can I ask you to please take your seats? All right. Let's get ready now for a very different American perspective, I think it is safe to say. It's time for a session that will be anything but dull, featuring two of the most outspoken voices in American business, media, and politics. Both are influential investors and entrepreneurs. Both are fierce supporters of the MAGA movement, and both know exactly how to keep a crowd engaged. One is the son of the President of the United States, the other isn't. Together, well, what I can say is that you probably won't need a cup of coffee. They will keep you engaged and awake. So please welcome Donald Trump Jr. and Omid Malik and our moderator, Sky's Yelda Hakim.
Thank you, and good morning. Welcome to this session. I know many of you have been eagerly awaiting this particular panel. My guests don't need much of an introduction, but I'm going to give you one anyway. Mr. Donald Trump Jr., partner at 1789 Capital, and Mr. Omid Malik, founder and CEO of 1789 Capital. And this really is an opportunity to discuss how the economic and political landscape is changing in the United States as well as here in the Middle East, but also a chance to discuss how diplomacy is shaping investment opportunities. I just want to begin with a question to you both about 1789 Capital. The focus is, you know, a sort of America first investment, a MAGA economy. You've called it patriotic capitalism. Could you guys just explain what that means?
Yeah, sure. So first I'll start with the name. 1789 is a year that most people recognize as the French Revolution, where people's heads were cut off. But I feel like, you know, in the United States, for us, it means something different. It's actually the year the Bill of Rights was introduced. And that's central to the way we think about everything. The Bill of Rights is a uniquely American document. It affords us certain protections. Countries similar to us, even like the United Kingdom, do not have a Bill of Rights, by the way. And Don and I came up with the idea for this fund really at the height of the Biden administration. And there were a few things that were going on that concerned us greatly. The first was what we felt was an unholy alliance between the largest corporations, mostly in big tech, with the federal government, in cahoots to basically undermine some of those constitutional protections, namely the First Amendment. Now, you saw this when factual counter-information was being provided around things like COVID and vaccines, and you were shut down. So there was an assault on the First Amendment, and we believed that was at the behest of a federal government under Biden. We were very concerned about that. And at the same time as well, you started seeing other people in the private sector not do anything about it. In fact, in the area we're in, which is venture capital or private investing, just the opposite was occurring. The most prominent venture capital firm at the time is called Sequoia Capital. They went and launched a China-only investment fund. And I like to joke, this is like if in the 80s a fund started a Soviet-only fund. So this was kind of the backdrop into where we found ourselves, and Don and I weren't going to take it. We wanted to do something about it, and so we started 1789.
Is the sort of background to this also driven by this rivalry and competition and threat coming from China?
I think 100%. The world has realized where China stands. I think when you look at the alliances that we're talking about, even on this very stage, countries coming together to solve and major conflicts around the world, I think that's fundamentally important. China has acted as an actor for themselves. I think the number one thing that we've realized over the last 4 years in the prior administration was that a weak America by itself is not just bad for America, it's bad for the entire world. We've seen the conflicts arise, we've seen the wars break out. I think in my father's first 9 months, he solved 7 or 8 wars that, honestly, the average American didn't even know was occurring. He was criticized by many during the primaries for saying all he wants to do is stop the death. Think about that. Criticized for just wanting to stop the death, whether that's Ukraine, Russia, whether that's Gaza, whether it's Thailand, Cambodia, whether it's the stuff in Rwanda. Wasn't that always the most common solution? Wasn't that the holy grail of geopolicy? Getting wars to stop and stopping the death, and yet he was criticized, and we realized he was criticized because there's no money in peace, there's only money in war. And so trying to be the guy that solves that, I guess, puts a target on your back, because a lot of powerful entities have profiteered very much from that. And so we wanted to make sure that we created something that hasn't existed in a while, and we saw that yesterday in the opening ceremonies here. Justice. Justice is a great idea, but it has not been weighed equally. Justice has been weaponized. It has been benefited, to one side only. And a big part of that can't just come from government and governmental entities. We actually have to do that in the private sector as well. One without the other doesn't work. And so that was a big focus of 1789 and what we wanted to do, to fund those companies that exist that agree with the fundamental tenets of so many of the freedoms that we are afforded as Americans. And we want to make sure that happens for the rest of the world as well.
There's a straight line to the decline of the American middle class with our embrace of China starting with its entrance in the WTO. And I blame our policymakers more than I blame our Chinese for outsourcing our entire supply chain to a country that's 4 times our size. During the George W. Bush and Obama presidencies, you saw this decline accelerate. And the issue that we have is it's not just the policymakers, they were aided and abetted by corporate America that were willing to do that and outsource all of their activities, and then that undermined the middle class in the United States. This is a period of deterioration, and the policymakers and corporate America, again, who then at the same time were embracing this concept of wokeism and ESG policies that made absolutely no sense to shareholder value. It's now established that it actually destroyed shareholder value. And what else were we doing? Fighting wars and quagmires in the Middle East where we were spending trillions of dollars unnecessarily. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq got us absolutely nothing. So again, when you talk about further intervention in the Middle East, and again, this is why President Trump won. He was the first to call out China, and he was first to very vocally be against these unnecessary wars. That's why he won. People were sick of it. So if anybody else wants to start another war, the burden is not on us to say no. They have the criminal burden of proof, beyond a reasonable doubt, to do another folly.
In fact, during the campaign, he was accused of perhaps trying to start wars. That was kind of a slogan that many people pushed, his critics.
I mean, it was probably one of the dumbest soundbites in the history of soundbites, but again, when the narrative was controlled by one side, when censorship was running rampant and it was really functioning as the cheerleader for the left, that was ridiculous. I mean, Donald Trump was labeled as the guy that was going to start World War III. Ironically, it wasn't Donald Trump where all these wars started. Russia didn't invade Ukraine under Donald Trump. They did it, under Obama. They did it again under Joe Biden because, again, they understood that feckless leadership in the White House would allow the bad actors of the world to run rampant. That's a story as old as time. Predators prey on the weak, and if America is weak, the predators are going to act. So that great irony that Donald Trump was going to start World War III when he's the only one in modern foreign policy history who's actually solving wars shouldn't be lost on people, and yet it's something that no one's ever going to speak about.
We're going to talk about the Middle East and Ukraine in a moment, but I just want to go back to China because, of course, we know that China dominates and controls the critical minerals. Can America catch up, and how?
100%. We just have to get active. The reality is that the way that China has conducted themselves, especially in Africa as it relates to rare earth minerals, they show up with a briefcase of cash, they pay off someone, they promise jobs, they show up and they bring their own workers. They promise infrastructure, they build it, and 2 years later it crumbles into the ground, and then they leave, leaving a wake of destruction in their background. I think so many of the African nations have woken up to the way that China behaves, and I think that opens up an opportunity for American companies to go in there. Our mandate is we invest in America, but so many other American companies will go into these areas if they feel that they can actually deal on a fair playing field. That has to be created. We've seen the supply chain crises issues over the years. America can no longer just sit there and hope that China is going to be a good actor and distribute these things around the world. I think the rest of the world also understands that they want America to be at the forefront of all of that because they understand where they stand with China as well.
The entire ethos of 1789 Capital is about the reindustrialization of the United States. So we are totally behind that. Everything we invest in within the United States does one of two things, either enhances the security or prosperity of America. And reindustrialization doesn't mean making the same types of widgets you made 50 years ago for those people who try to undermine our sentiment. In fact, it means winning in the new economy around areas like artificial intelligence that also, I think, have demonstrated that if you outsource your supply chain, you don't have true national security or sovereignty. We saw this very clearly in COVID. If another country produces the most important goods for your country, then you're in trouble. And we could not do anything with the Chinese during that period of time because they were making things like all of our pharmaceuticals. So it's a national imperative for the private sector to step up and start investing in areas like this. And we're doing that at 1789. And the great thing is during this period, we have an administration who is being very active in supporting that as well.
I want to bring your focus and attention back here to the Middle East. We've just heard from the Qatari Prime Minister, and of course, Qatar was pivotal when it came to ceasefire talks in the Middle East. And we saw President Trump's 21 peace point plan that he worked with leaders in this region. But the ceasefire is fragile. Do you think it can be sustained?
I think it can, but I think we also have to recognize what's going on. I mean, I think that was pretty breaking news to find out that both the Israelis and the United States basically asked Qatar to bring in some of these people because you're having talks, not just with nation states, but other actors, whether we agree that they're bad or good, they still have to be a part of that peace process. The fact that Qatar was able to do that, they did that at the behest of the United States and Israel, and didn't say anything as they're being critiqued around the world because they had the objective of actually getting to peace, and rather than throwing your allies under the bus to save some PR headaches, they did that. I want more allies like that. I want more partners like that. Very different than what we've seen from places like perhaps the European Union over the last few years, although we didn't see that much yesterday, but over the last few years where it was like, you know what, I'll get a great soundbite in the media if we critique Trump's plan. Even though our foreign policy experts, and I say experts very loosely because if you're an expert but you haven't been right about anything in about 25 to 50 years, you should likely lose your expert status. That doesn't actually happen. So to have an ally like that that's willing to take those hits because of the greater good, to get to a resolution rather than to solve a PR headache in the day, I mean, I think that's true leadership and should be commended.
We just also heard the Qatari Prime Minister, Tucker, asked him whether, Qatar was going to pay for Israel's destruction, and it was clear that they're not going to. But is the Trump administration, from your perspective, committed to ensuring that there is a reconstruction program? Because there are many who fear that the administration is going to move on pretty quickly and not sort of stay at the long course.
Well, I think without question, I mean, if there's one thing my father is, he's a builder. I know, obviously, he's been in politics for the last decade, but he got there by being a builder, so he understands how to do that. I do also know, though, that he understands that the American public isn't going to do what they used to do for years, where we're just going to be the big dumb guy with the checkbook and we're going to cover all of the world's problems and no one else has to do their part. I think he can be, the greatest construction manager in the history of the world, but no one in America wants to bear the entire responsibility of that. That's happened for far too long. Everyone has their ideas. Everyone wants to do X, Y, Z. When it comes to actually writing a check and breaking out their own checkbook, well, we're not interested in that. That changes things. The American public doesn't have the appetite to fund everything for everyone all over the world with no direct benefit to themselves. So I think he can be the manager that brings that together, but everyone's going to actually have to step up and do their part and not just leave it to the United States to cover everything.
Omer, do you think that the private sector has a role to play when it comes to, say, the reconstruction of Gaza?
I'm sure. I mean, I think that there'll probably be an opportunity for the private sector, but also there'll be governments that step up and, to help solve this issue. I mean, again, we're here as business people, and our focus is mostly in the United States, though.
I want to focus on Ukraine because, of course, as you say, you're both here in the capacity of business leaders, but you've also been instrumental in shaping the message of the administration. You talked about Europeans, and Europeans are concerned that Ukraine is going to be abandoned. Are those fears valid?
I don't think Ukraine is going to be abandoned, but I think for years, again, it was the same thing as the last answer, which is, well, we want to attack Russia. We want to do this. Well, when it comes to actually writing a check ourselves, no, the U.S. is going to do it. The American public doesn't have an appetite for that. Since the invasion of Ukraine, I heard major leaders, Mitch McConnell, the leader of the Senate in the United States, saying, it's the #1 issue for Republicans in the United States. And I say, that's weird. I speak to Republicans all over the country every day, probably far more than Mitch has ever spoken to, despite his 379-year career in politics. I did that on a weekly basis, and I surveyed people at every talk I did. It got to the point where it was probably well over 200,000 Americans that I spoke to directly. And I'd be in a room like this, and I'd ask, is Russia-Ukraine a top 3 issue for anyone in the room? Nothing. Is it a top 10 issue for anyone in the room? I think I got 3 people that once said it was a top 10 issue. 3 out of hundreds surveyed, hundreds of thousands, every weekend for 2 years, till basically through the campaign. One person misunderstood the question. He thought it was a double negative. One person was actually from Kiev, so he was like, it was a big deal for him. And the other person was, I think on the board of Raytheon. So there was no appetite for that, but that didn't stop a Republican Party from saying it's the #1 issue. It's not, and we actually have to listen to the will of those people. So we want peace, we want to stop the death, but I even saw that yesterday where, on this very stage, what was the idea for Europe, who is on the border of Ukraine, who has much more at stake if this happens? Well, our plan is to win economically. when pressed on the issue. How are you going to do that? Well, we're just going to wait for Russia to go bankrupt. That's not a plan. That's not an idea. The gentleman from Spain was a lovely guy. I saw him last night later on at the forum, but Spain was putting in 2.2% rather than the 5% required by NATO, because my father actually wanted people who are the biggest stakeholders to get into the game. Well, we feel that our 2.2% is being utilized more efficiently, and therefore we're not. That's not an answer. That's not a solution. And again, I understand why they are there, because America has set a precedent for decades that they'll just write the check. But if the will of the people isn't there, everyone needs to step up. Everyone has to do their share. And that includes what's happening here in the Middle East. If we do that collectively, we can get to an answer. But if we default to the old ways of America's just going to be the big idiot with a checkbook, that's not going to work. That's not going to happen. And you saw what happened. When my father starts threatening they're going to pull out, we're not going to do this anymore, because he's listening to the people that elected him to office. The whole world, this is outrageous. It's not outrageous, it's common sense. When we're bombing drug boats in the Caribbean, people who are literally bringing in fentanyl to America, something that kills 100,000 Americans a year. Okay, just for perspective, that's 2 Vietnam Wars a year in America. The neocon establishment, the Democrats, how dare you do this? I mean, that's a far greater, clear and present danger to the United States than anything going on in Ukraine and Russia, and yet they're against it. Think of the insanity of that. So my father has a common sense approach to everything. That's because rather than being a lifelong bureaucrat who's never actually done anything in the real world, he has, and he understands what that means, and we have to act accordingly.
Yeah, so I just want to say one thing on that. Going back to the gentlelady that spoke yesterday, I think she had a Freudian slip, at least I hope it was one, where she talked about what we did to the Russians in Afghanistan. That's not a great comp, by the way. Okay, that's a horrible comp. What we were doing, we're funding a mujahideen that create radicalization in that country, and we know what we reaped after that. Let's just, I'm a business person, I look at this. We've spent almost $300 billion over there, and now we find out that Zelensky's number 2 is under investigation for corruption. Where's the audit of where any of that money went? We should be asking those questions. We have over 300,000 people dead. It doesn't make sense as the United States to have enemies in both Russia, China, and then also add Iran in there. So from a strategic standpoint, again, speaking as a private citizen, my sense is you should act as a reverse Kissinger, neutralize the Russians, and then focus on the real threat that nobody seems to want to talk about except his dad, who started the conversation, that China is the one that you need to focus on.
One of the most amazing things I got to witness, I was this summer with my beautiful girlfriend Bettina in Monaco, and we were driving around, and on an average day, 50% of the supercars, the Bugattis, the Ferraris, the this, all had Ukrainian plates. Do we think that was actually earned in Ukraine? I'd been to Ukraine 20 years ago. It wasn't like there was a plethora of wealth there. And yet, you see the number 2 there getting arrested for stealing hundreds of millions of dollars. You hear all the rumors about what's going on. When I see every license plate on a supercar in Monaco being Bugattis, the rich fled. They let what they believed to be the peasant class fight these wars. And there was no incentive to stop, because as long as the money train was coming and they were stealing it and no one was auditing anything, the leaders, the decision makers, there was no reason for them to ever come to peace. No different than Putin. It wasn't the son of oligarchs that were fighting these wars. It's someone from Siberia that they're sending there. And he utilized the war to rebuild his manufacturing base. It was very clear that the sanctions that we put on did nothing to actually help. All it did was jack up the price of oil, which allowed him to basically pay for the war with the delta between the two while building up his manufacturing base. There was no incentive for anyone to ever get to the table. Zelensky knew he wouldn't win another election again, and they were continuing to steal. Putin was building up his manufacturing base, and all we had in the wake was millions of young men dying for nothing.
I mean, obviously, Ukraine has a massive corruption issue, and as you say,
it was a far more corrupt country than Russia, as delegated by the United States government prior to this war. But then, because of the war, and because he's one of the great marketers of all time, Zelensky became a borderline deity, especially to the left, where he could do no wrong. He was beyond reproach. Years of corruption, years of graft and theft on a world stage that everyone in this room knew was happening, was totally absolved. And it's ridiculous. We're not dealing in reality.
But is your hunch that President Trump is going to walk away?
I think he may. What's good about my father and what's unique about my father is you don't know what he's going to do. The fact that he's not predictable, he's not following the playbook of every clown who's, again, been a bureaucrat for decades, you don't know. And so that forces everyone to actually deal in an intellectually honest capacity, which has not happened in far too long.
I want to ask you about Elon Musk, because of course your company 1789 deeply invested in many of Elon's companies. I mean, speaking of mediation, have you guys played a role in, we've seen the relationship between the president and Elon Musk go up and down. Have you guys sort of played a role in bringing that bromance back together?
I think without question we got to know Elon very, very intimately during the campaign and the transition process, maintained those relationships. I could get into the backstory of it, but it doesn't really matter. It was largely a manufactured crisis, and you also have two personalities. People often ask me, how is it with your father? I'm like, well, imagine dealing with one Donald Trump, now I have to deal with two. I mean, they're very similar that way. So it created some headaches, but the reality is, they're both very much aligned. They're on message with what we want to do for our country, with what we want to do for freedom of speech, and so much. I think Elon did incredible things with Twitter. I mean, really allowed the democratization of truth and freedom and free speech to occur, and that was something that was a true threat in America right now. When you look at what Elon's done in terms of his companies, I mean, it's a generational talent, a generational level of genius, and my father understands and respects that, and so it's great to see that going forward now. I mean, this is someone who is changing not just the face of freedom of speech, but the face of science and technology, advancing America's interests, and I think that's fundamentally important. We have to protect our geniuses.
He's back in the fold.
100%.
He's the Thomas Edison of our time. If you look at the companies, we're invested in his entire portfolio. Every single one really falls neatly into our thesis. SpaceX, for example, which, by the way, just announced a $800 billion valuation, which makes it the most valuable private company in America and therefore the world, has probably the greatest consumer product that anyone's ever used, which is Starlink. I'm not sure if you've used it, but you can basically have a flying office now thanks to that. But again, in the case of SpaceX, what you had is you had our government and NASA falling down, and you had a private sector solution to keep the space program afloat, which was SpaceX. And in the same way, as Don pointed out, I think he deserves an enormous amount of credit during a very dark period that I alluded to earlier for keeping free speech alive in America that was under threat when he acquired X or Twitter. That was a huge, huge thing he did, and that's why we're always going to be a supporter of him and his companies.
We've got 3 years left of the Trump administration. What can we expect?
I think a lot. The great irony was it actually felt very good in the last 24 hours that I've been here. The amount of leaders in this room who have come up to me, they may not say it on a public stage, I understand that gets you some criticism perhaps, but have come up and said, we have 3 years to act. They all get it. They understand that there is a chance that you fall back into the old ways, that everyone that came up to me, even at dinner last night, from all over the world, this is the greatest opportunity we've had to reset sort of the global discourse, to be able to effectuate actual change, because they understand that my father is a guy that can get things done. He's perhaps the only one that could get some of these people to a table, effectuate real peace, effectuate real trade, create something that's beneficial for the world. The reality is this: economically or otherwise, a rising tide lifts all boats. If these nations, whether it's Qatar, others in the GCC, are working with the United States, hopefully bringing in Europe, which has its own problems, and that's been a consistent theme throughout the last few months of me speaking at conferences, is what the hell's going on in Europe. But he's the one guy that can do it, and to see world leaders from all over the place understand that and recognize it, I think is a great opportunity, not again just for the United States, but for the world. They understand he's the guy, and it was really heartwarming to see literally dozens of people. This is a 3-year window. This is a window that we'll perhaps never have again to reset things for the good of the world, both business and politically.
I was going to just say, we had a conversation last night with a very smart individual here, and he basically said there are 4 things that you look for a great country. One is you have to have extremely strong leadership. You have to have innovative technology, a strong military, and access to cheap energy. The United States right now has all 4 of those, which makes time of the essence. But I also think it's a segue into what you were about to ask also, which is the relationship with this region. Right now, we're mostly focused on the battle for artificial intelligence in the private sector, and there are 2 areas that are going to be most starved. That's access to capital and access to cheap energy. In particular the case of the Gulf, but even Qatar more specifically with natural gas and capital, they're going to have a big role to play. And I think that's really, if I have to make any point, is, you know, the United States for a long period of time, maybe through complacency or idiocy, however you want to call it, had an idealistic foreign policy. That does not work, and we've seen that time and time over again. Donald Trump has implemented a pragmatic foreign policy, and that kind of transactional perspective gives the opportunity, particularly for this region, to become real partners of the United States.
Is he likely to run again?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Is he likely to run again?
Well, we'll see what happens then. But you know, you never know. I never count him out for anything. But it is funny to watch the leftist heads explode every time he brings it up. So perhaps he's just doing a little bit of trolling. But again, he's the most unpredictable person probably in the history of politics, which is why he's able to get something done. And so I guess we'll have to see.
Don, Omid, thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Yalda. Thank you to Donald Trump Jr. and Omid Malik for sharing with us their unique insights into the often unpredictable trends in the United States. We will quickly reset our stage before we resume with our next panel discussion on the new Syria. We'll be back in a couple of minutes. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, time now for our next session where we turn the spotlight on the new Syria. We assess the progress the country has made over the last 12 months, the opportunities it has seized and the challenges that still lie ahead. December 8th, 2024 is now commemorated in Syria as Liberation Day, when opposition armed forces entered Damascus and declared Bashar al-Assad's rule over. Those events, you'll remember, unfolded during the last Doha Forum, taking the world by surprise and reshaping regional dynamics in ways very few expected, and of course, needless to say, overshadowing much of the discussions here at the Doha Forum. Our next session looks at what has changed over the last year, what has been achieved, and what challenges still lie ahead. Please welcome our distinguished panelists, Their Excellencies Mohammed bin Abdulaziz Al Khulaifi, Minister of State of the State of Qatar, Asad Al-Shaybani, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Syrian Arab Republic, Espen Barth Eide, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Kingdom of Norway, and last but not least, Tom Barak, US Ambassador to the Republic of Turkey and Special Envoy to the Syrian Arab Republic. And please welcome your moderator, Charles Lister, Director of the Syria Program at the Middle East Institute.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this latest session of the Doha Forum. My name is Charles Lister from the Middle East Institute, and I'm delighted to be here on such an esteemed stage with esteemed colleagues. Last year, the Doha Forum witnessed history as Bashar al-Assad's regime came to an abrupt and dramatic end, closing a 53-year chapter of brutal dictatorial rule in Syria. In the year since, the country's transition has proceeded forwards, facing down an extraordinary array of internal and external challenges. On the international stage, Syria has transformed from a global pariah to a fully fledged and, I think many would say, integral component of the international community. In fact, I gather that Syria has received in 12 months more international delegations from more countries around the world than Syria has done over the previous 5 decades. At home, Syria bears the brunt of 14 years of debilitating conflict and decades of corrupt, divisive rule, leaving a broken economy, a traumatized population, a shattered state, and massive destruction. But despite all of these challenges, the world has rushed to engage and support the new Syria. I think buoyed by the historic opportunity that a stable, responsible, and recovering Syria will offer to regional and international peace and prosperity. So let me first start with Minister Shaybani. It's very good to see you again, and thank you for being here. As you reflect on this past year, how would you summarize where things stand today after 12 months in terms of achievements, but also, I think, lessons learned from the threats and the challenges that you still face, both inside your country, but also from outside?
بداية أولا شكرا لكم على هذه الاستضافة. بالتأكيد عندما نتحدث عن سوريا في هذا الوقت أو خلال عام واحد وخاصة ما بعد 8 من ديسمبر فنحن نتكلم عن قصة نجاح صاغها السوريون بأنفسهم، وأيضا أوصلوا صورة سريعة للعالم بأن الشعب السوري قادر على أن يتجاوز الماضي وأيضا أن ينظر إلى المستقبل بعين الثقة وأيضا بإرادة قوية جدا. ما تم تحقيقه خلال سنة كاملة ربما يحتاج إلى الكثير من العمل في السنوات القادمة، ولكن الشيء الذي نحن سعداء فيه أننا أعدنا ثقة الشعب السوري بنفسه، الثقة التي كانت النظام قد ساهم في تشويهها وأيضا ساهم في إضعاف هذه الثقة، وأصدر الشعب السوري أو صدر الشعب السوري للعالم على أنه شعب تحت الضغط، تحت الحروب، شعب مستضعف، شعب لا يصلح لأن يكون من بين الدول المتطورة. فما استطعنا أن نحققه ونحن فخورين فيه هو مسألة أننا اليوم الشعب السوري ينظر إلى نفسه بثقة كبيرة جدا في كافة المجالات. بالتأكيد الدروس المستفادة أن أي حكومة تعمل لبلدها بإخلاص وتعمل أيضا بكامل قوتها ستنجز الكثير رغم قلة الإمكانيات ورغم الإرث الثقيل جدا الذي ورثناه من النظام السابق، إلا أننا ما تم المراهنة عليه أننا انطلقنا بدعم من شعبنا، وهذا ما أعطانا النجاحات التي كانت خلال السنة الماضية. وبالتأكيد إلى جانبي أيضا من زملائي شركائنا في هذا النجاح، والكل وقف إلى جانب سوريا حقيقة في هذا العام، وبالتأكيد الأعوام القادمة ستكون أكثر فيها الكثير من الحماسة والكثير من الانطلاق نحو المستقبل. وأننا بالتأكيد يعني ما وصلنا إليه يعطينا الثقة، ولكن لسنا راضين بهذه النتيجة. الشعب السوري يستحق أن تكون لديه دولة يعني أفضل من الوضع الحالي، وبالتأكيد الوضع المعيشي والاقتصادي في الداخل السوري لا يزال يعاني بشكل كبير، ولا تزال هناك أيضا عقبات قانونية وخاصة موضوع العقوبات الاقتصادية وأبرزها عقوبات سيسر. بالتأكيد يحتاج الأمر منا الكثير من العمل، ولكن ما نستطيع أن نقوله أننا أعدنا إصلاح العلاقة بين الشعب السوري وحكومته.
Excellency Dr. Khalifi, a similar question to you, starting out big picture. Qatar and your government has taken a strong and consistent stance on Syria since the very beginning, and I think was ideally placed to adapt to the fundamental transformation we saw a year ago. I mean, how would you characterize from Qatar's perspective how the past 12 months have gone? What are you envisioning from your policy perspective, what year two needs to look like? What are your new challenges as we enter into this second year of Syria's transition?
Thank you very much, Charles, and it's good to be in this panel with my distinguished colleagues. A few points to take into consideration when we're discussing the Syrian case. First of all, Qatar has been very firm when it comes to its position in full support of the Syrian people. In 14 years, we haven't changed that position. When we see the others, they were shifting in the political decision, we remain firm, believing strongly that this is the right path for the Syrians to restore their full rights, a country that is sovereign, that is prosperous, and providing an opportunity for the people to live a better life. This is something that is very critical in the top leadership of the country, following up the administrative bodies, and we've been very much engaged since day one of that topic. If you allow me, interesting fact, last year at this forum, in this hotel specifically, we were discussing the Syrian case, following up the movements by the Syrians on the ground. Interesting fact, we spent more than 4 or 5 hours with the group, the Astana group format, as well as regional countries, discussing what is going to be the next step. Is it going to be reasonable now for Bashar al-Assad to lower the bar and start engaging productively? But our friends and our brothers didn't save time, I think, for that operation. Things has moved so quickly. Our policy since day one, never shy out, engage, go and talk to our brothers over there on the ground, stretch our hands of support and help for the Syrian people and the Syrian government. And we've been very consistent, honestly, in terms of that help. We have a highly distinguished institutions, even at the humanitarian level. Qatar Funds for Development, education above all. All of them, they've been outreached over there and they've been engaged in several activities and projects within the Syrian government. I think in terms, if I want to assess the 12 months for Qatar's and Syria partnership, it's never been stronger. We've been so close and we've been very engaged in the different sectors, at the energy sectors, at the financial sectors, even at the international level. We've been very much supporting that Syrian cause because we strongly believe in it. We think this is the right pathway and this is what the Syrian people believes and deserves. And therefore I think how we see generally Syria, we see it regionally as well.
We've seen the developments in the regional countries as well, and that brings, honestly, comfort at the decision makers levels in Doha and in the general wider scope. We've seen the developments in Lebanon, for example, with the election of presidents and the permanent government. We've seen the recent election in Iraq. All of them, that helps us that the movement is on the right pathway when it comes to the political stability. That helps us, but we will always consider ourselves a reliable partners for those regional countries, and we will continue to engage with them.
Thank you. Minister Ida, you as Foreign Minister of Norway, you were an early visitor to Damascus, and so you've visited and seen things from very early on since Assad's fall. Again, a similar question to you, but obviously from Norway's perspective and the wider European region, which traditionally has looked at Syria with different priorities. So from your perspective, what steps has Norway taken over the past 12 months to engage and to support Syria's transition? And as you look to year 2, with all of the challenges that Syria faces, as they pertain to Norway and to wider Europe, what's your assessment today?
Thank you, Charles. So I also vividly remember the Saturday of Doha Forum a year ago, where in the morning panels we were discussing whether ever Assad would go, and in the afternoon panel he had left. So, it was very much being present at a very historic moment. And I was looking back at the statement I made and many of my colleagues made, and found out that they were quite good. We said, this opens up an opportunity. It will not be easy. The new forces, the new government needs our support. We need to give this a chance. We shall not be naive, but we need a process that is Syrian-owned and Syrian-led, and we want an inclusive Syria. And I also argue that if we do not give this opportunity a chance, we will probably be right. I mean, if we assume it will fail, we will help it to fail. If we, however, we assume that it can succeed, we might contribute to the Syrian success, but the success has to be a Syrian success. And I must say, recognizing the long list of challenges that the government still faces, and let's not be naive, I think on balance, this year has been well spent. And I have to say, being a frequent critique of the international community, this time we got it right. There was a broad agreement from an surprisingly early stage that we should not leave the new government with inherited sanctions for the failures of a previous government. Well, let them at least do their own failures before we sanction them. And that argument, I went, as you said, early January, when an early visitor came out very strongly, arguing with our American friends, our European friends, we need to do something on these sanctions, and that largely worked. And I think that encouragement was so important, and my early meetings with President al-Shara was very much focused on practical aspects of economy, the need for early recovery, to reap this peace dividend while people still had trust. And I'm proud that we were able to establish links on energy, on health, on the transitional justice, on other key issues, but also increasingly working with the government. And we were early in working with the government directly, and in hindsight, I think we got it right this time.
Yes, absolutely. And Ambassador Barak, just tying on to exactly what Minister Ida was just saying, on the question of engagement and sanctions and all of the developments we've seen take place over the last 6 months or so in particular, it's not a secret that there were components of the Trump administration that were probably skeptical of Syria when President Trump first came into the office. But of course in May, to the president's huge credit, he took the step to meet with President al-Shara in Saudi Arabia and fundamentally changed the game. So my question to you really is just, what drove that decision? And the extraordinarily bold, I think, step that the US government has taken since, which has broken every record in terms of sanctions relief and diplomatic engagement in post-conflict environments.
Number one, thanks, Charles, for heading this super important panel. But I think, and you heard from Don Jr., who I'm so proud of for everything that he and his family has accomplished through great political battles. But with credit to my boss, President Trump, which is not political, right? The vagaries of the West are not attributed to one
political party or another. But since 1916, the West has not done a very good job at guiding or providing architecture to this region. Since Sykes-Picot, almost every decision that the West has imposed on the region, rather than letting the region evolve itself, has been a mistake, and we're living with the aftermath of that. So, although President Trump may be unpredictable in some senses, he's really not. He's studied. And he saw the vagaries of the past, of what had happened with our interference in coups and regime change from World War II. We invented everything, right? We invented NATO. We invented the United Nations. We invented UNESCO. We invented the CIA. We invested the Marshall Plan. We invested Bretton Woods. And if you were to evaluate all of them and their efficacy on this region, you'd probably give them a very low mark. President Trump had studied the situation, and quite honestly, when he got off the plane in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, and the Crown Prince had invited the foreign minister's boss, President El-Shara, he made a determination on the ground based on lots of study that this region is about athletes. It's not about federalism. It's not about democracy. It's not about centralization. It's about leadership. He decided, and spending some time with President El-Shara, that to give them a chance, to give this leader the opportunity to create their own architecture and allow it to happen without interference. So what we did, the contribution this time for America, was very different than it's ever been. We said, we're not going to labor you with hopes and expectations of a democratic structure that has never been feasible in the past. We're going to allow you to decide your own structure. Miraculously, in that 10 months, the foreign minister, who I spend a lot of time with, I applied to be his barista, but I can't keep up with him. He's a rocket ship. They all are. And I have to tell you, I think from President Trump and Secretary Rubio's point of view, which we do, in relieving them of sanctions, we go through a report card. If you remember, Secretary Rubio in March had sat down with Foreign Minister Shabani and given him a section of 8 expectations of things that you all want. Integration of all the communities, the continuing investigation into missing persons, the care and taking of camps, the dismantling of foreign fighters, the chemical weapons, which has always been an issue. And honestly, on those issues, for a very small team, in my humble personal opinion, I give them an A in all of those categories in which they had very limited resources. So I think President Trump's instincts, along with a very understandable team headed by Secretary Rubio in evaluating lessons of the past, was all about let's pick the athletes, not necessarily the stadium. And in our estimation, it's heroic and epic what they've done in what will be 2 years and a couple of days. And what we all have to do is help them, entitle them, encourage them, and allow them to form the kind of government and inclusive regime that they, the Syrians, would like to do. But we're very proud of them.
Thank you very much. Minister Shaybani, back to you. When you entered Damascus, one of the things President Shara publicly announced very early on was the importance of Syria having a foreign policy that sought problems with nobody. In other words, a balanced foreign policy. You seek to engage with everyone, whether you have differences or similarities. And I think over the past year, I'm not an expert on Asia or other regions of the world, but I can't think of many countries around the world that have managed to sustain, especially in a complex post-conflict environment, a balanced relationship with every one of the world's major players and everyone in between. My question to you really is how long do you think that complex foreign policy can be sustained? It is going to get more complicated with time. Do you think that there will come a time when you'll have to start choosing to prioritize more in one direction than the other? Are you already facing that situation? And if you do, how will you deal with that challenge?
شكرا لك. بالتأكيد يعني بعد تحرير سوريا وخاصة يعني بعد أن تفاجأنا بحجم التدهور الذي وجدناه في يعني المؤسسات السورية وأيضا بالإرث السياسة الخارجية التي أيضا ورثناها من النظام البائد، أن هناك علاقات سيئة جدا مع الجوار، علاقات سيئة جدا مع الدول الأوروبية، مع الولايات المتحدة، وأيضا هناك قائمة غير لا يمكن تحديدها من العقوبات. فتفاجأنا بالكم الهائل من هذه المقيدات أو هذه القيود التي ستعرقل عملية إعادة البناء التي بدأناها في بعد الانتهاء من إسقاط النظام البائد في اليوم التالي يعني مباشرة. بالتأكيد أن بناء أي سياسة متوازنة في بلد في الشرق الأوسط ربما هذه من أصعب المهمات التي ربما تحاول كل البلدان وكل الدول أن تجاهد أن تحافظ يعني على سياسة متوازنة، خاصة أننا في عالم مستقطب في استقطاب كبير جدا، وخاصة في منطقتنا أيضا هناك حساسية عالية جدا من أي اصطفاف وأي توجه، وأيضا هناك يعني قراءة معمقة جدا لأي تحرك حتى في النوايا وفي التصريحات السياسية، وأيضا حتى في المشاريع الاقتصادية وحتى في المشاركات الدولية. فتقريبا الشرق الأوسط نحن تحت المجهر في كل تفصيل، لكن بلد مثل سوريا بالتأكيد يحتاج إلى علاقة هادئة مع الجميع، ويحتاج أيضا أن تساعده الدول على تحقيق هذه السياسة أيضا. يعني نحن نطلق النوايا ونطلق التحركات، ولكن أيضا الاستجابات من الدول يجب أيضا أن يساعدونا على إنجاز هذه المهمة، لأن البناء بلد عانى من الحرب بعد 14 سنة بالتأكيد يحتاج إلى الكثير من الأصدقاء، ويحتاج إلى كل الأصدقاء، ولا يحتاج إلى أن نختار وأن نتخير من نريد وماذا لا نريد، أو أن نصطف باصطفافات حتى لو كانت تقليدية، وهذا الشيء سيعرقل من مسيرة إعادة الإعمار. بعد إزالة نظام الهدم الذي كان متمثل بالنظام البائد، بدأ النظام وحكومة البناء. حكومة البناء تحتاج إلى استقرار أمني في الداخل وأيضا ربط مع الأمن الإقليمي والدولي، وهذا ما نعمل عليه مع يعني أشقائنا في المنطقة وأيضا مع الشركاء الدوليين. ويحتاج إلى تنمية اقتصادية مكثفة وفرص استثمارية، ويحتاج أيضا إلى دبلوماسية تعزز وتسهل هذين الركنين. بالتأكيد اليوم سوريا تتمتع بعلاقات متنوعة ومتعددة، ونطمح إلى أن تكون هذه التجربة أيضا ملهمة وفريدة في المنطقة، ونعتقد أننا سننجح لأن هناك أيضا إرادة دولية بإنجاح هذه التجربة، وأيضا هناك إعجاب، خاصة أن الدبلوماسية التي ننتهجها في سوريا دبلوماسية واضحة وشفافة وفيها الكثير من الصدق، وليس فيها يعني اللف والدوران خلينا بالعامية يعني، لكن فيها التركيز على هدف أننا نحن عانينا كثيرا من هذه الحرب، نريد أن نعيد بناء بلدنا، نريد الكثير من الأصدقاء، لا نريد أن نقوم بأي اصطفاف. فضمن هذه المعايير أعتقد أننا إلى الآن نجحنا. ربما في المستقبل ستكون هناك تحديات، وربما ستجر سوريا إلى بعض المناطق الحرجة، ولكن سنعيد التركيز أننا على مسافة واحدة من الجميع، ونريد أن تكون علاقاتنا قائمة مع الجميع على أساس من التعاون والاحترام والشراكات السياسية والاقتصادية.
Thank you. So just to exactly tie into that question, Your Excellency Khalifi, the Middle East has experienced quite a profound time of crisis over the past couple of years. And there's a sense to which, whether you look west, east, north or south, the region appears to be in a state of flux. Of course, the aspiration and the objective here is that this should all offer an opportunity for a more peaceful future. And I think Syria has a kind of central role geographically as well as strategically to play in there. But as Minister Shobani was just saying, there is the potential that Syria could face some sensitive geopolitical challenges in the coming month. And of course, there are sensitive internal challenges in Syria too. So I just wonder, without wanting to put more things on your very busy agenda, is there an opportunity for a country like Qatar, which specializes so much in mediation, to attempt to tackle or add to the attempts to tackle some of those sensitive geopolitical challenges that surround Syria today?
Well, first of all, Syria is on my agenda. And on behalf of the state of Qatar, we've been, as I told you, the strategy is to continue our direct engagement with our Syrian colleagues on the different sectors. In the past 12 months, we were focusing on the main infrastructure within the country, aviation, financial industry, energy. The projects that we have accomplished so far is pleasing. However, it's still not enough. There are still more potential for Syria to prosperous with other areas and other fields. And I believe the openness that we have seen from President Shara and from the governments to international investors to join and play an important role within the future of Syria is something that very critical and will put Syria in a unique place in the future. One element which worries us a lot is the security element. This is something that I believe, and I had a thorough discussion with our savvy lawyer and friend, savvy ambassador, I apologize, and friend Tom Barak on the security element and the importance for Syria to be preserved and the people will feel safe within the country, something that is extremely important. The Israeli aggression on Syria is unacceptable, and this is something that needs to stop. Syria needs to be provided with the opportunity to do that, and we've been calling for the international community to hold that responsibility of preventing any further escalations on Syria. This is something that is equally treated on Lebanon, where we see the government is acting around the clock in developing and improving the internal situation in the country. So those countries in the region needs to be provided with that opportunity, and I believe empowering in the next phase, if I can see how Syria can move in the next phase, focusing on that security element is something that is extremely important. We will continue our engagement with the Syrian governments on that angle and other angles as well, and also our direct coordination at the international level. I mean, you might heard in the past of what we call by the Friends of Syria. This is an important group. We needed to revive the international coordination on the Syrian file to put it on top when it comes to the important matters that the Syrian governments needs to take into look, or even work closely with the Syrian governments to overcome many of those challenges. I believe in the upcoming months, it will be very critical for us to engage even further, to work closely with the Syrian governments to combat many of those challenges and especially the security threats that the Syrians are facing, encouraging and continue to encourage the governments to take the important steps for the Syrian people. And I believe we had a very thorough and transparent engagement also with the Syrian governments on that line. I honestly, among the other cases, and you gave us a very good introduction about the, sorry to say this, but the unfortunate situation that our Middle East is in, that there are still hope. And we see hope in Syria. And we think the future will be, inshallah, better. Thank you.
Yes, inshallah. I totally agree. And I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of greater levels of international coordination and coordination with Damascus. And I think as we enter year 2, that will be all the more important. Minister Aida, on a slightly different tack, the international aid space has taken a significant hit and challenge over the recent years, not just because of instability, but of course, significant cuts from the United States have placed more of a burden on other traditional donors to the international aid world, of which Norway has played traditionally a significant role. And the issue on Syria, of course, is that we are now in transition, and so we will see a pivot away from aid and more towards early recovery, and of course investment once the Caesar Act, we hope, is removed within days. But nevertheless, there is still a huge strain in there. And in Syria, there is still huge need for similar activities as we pivot more towards that investment direction. So really just from your perspective, but also from Norway's wider engagement within Europe and the rest of the international community, are there efforts underway to try and fill some of those gaps in a case of like Syria?
Thank you. Let me just one sentence on the geopolitics, because I think the best thing Syria can do for the geopolitics of the region is exactly what it does, which is to focus on Syria. And I see the Prime Minister of Lebanon. I think it's quite welcome for some of the neighbors that Syria focuses on Syria, because we've had Syrians who focused on other things, and breaking the the direct geographical link between Iran and Hezbollah, for instance, is an improvement in regional security. And that's just because Syria focused on Syria. And I think other countries in the neighborhood, including Israel, should, contrary to what they are doing, they should actually recognize that we have a Syria that wants to be Syrian-led and Syrian-owned, but with a focus on rebuilding Syria. Which brings me to your question, because if that's good for geopolitics, it means that the rest of us would be well advised to help them to recover quickly. And we, for our sake, for Norway's sake, is that we've already moved beyond early recovery. We're into long-term recovery, to long-term investments and developments. Of course, it's early days for classical investments, but focusing on energy, for instance, is a very important prerequisite for other industrial initiatives, for rebuilding of key infrastructures. So working on, not only humanitarian aid and early recovery, but actually engaging in economic development, where you'll need some help from your friends. But Syria is a country of traders. It's in the middle of the region. There's a tremendous economic potential that the president and the foreign minister and others keep speaking about. So it's really to connect to that, and let's not wait too long. Because if we don't act early, more negative trends can follow. Not necessarily to comment on American developments, but it is a problem that development support from traditional donors is falling. It happens with USAID, but it also happens with other countries, sometimes for ideological reasons, sometimes more for lack of money. That means that the rest of us who are still in need to use our money smarter, and also think about how state development money can also, in a more immediate and faster way, inspire private investments and more traditional economic recovery and opening up for trade.
Thank you. Ambassador Barak, this is a tricky question here, which is, rightly or wrongly, correctly or incorrectly, the United States often gets lumped with the responsibility to fix big problems. And when it comes to Syria, the issue of Israel has come up repeatedly, and I think that remains a significant challenge. And I know one that you have been engaged in. But also the integration of the Syrian Democratic Forces into the state, which has been a challenging file for the last 10 months or so, as well as the challenge related to Sweden. And I noticed yesterday that we now have State Department engagement with the Sweden file, with some meetings that were held yesterday. So I just wonder if I could ask you for perhaps to update the audience on where those three particularly thorny geopolitical and internal challenges stand, and where your and the United States engagement stands on those.
Thanks for that very simple question. Look, everything is in process, and let's start from the beginning of America's point of view. America was engaged in one of the most brutal battles ever in history, called the Civil War. Now, all of us in the Western world no longer want to talk about minorities, but the Civil War was a majority in the Union versus a minority, which was Confederates. And we have spent 100 years trying to define what is that. Is that a federation? Is it a republic? Is it a union? What is it? How do you blend these communities, which have different cultural aspects and different desires, different religions, different educational formats, hundreds of years of their own history? In a country like America, which has a new beginning, how do you do it in a civilization that has thousands of years of history, in which survival was based on the tribe, it was based on family, it was based on your brother? Then it evolved to a community, and then from a community it evolved to religion, and from religion then it evolved into sectors, and ultimately we invented nation states. There was no such thing until the beginning of the 1900s. So blending these very difficult issues, America has taken the point of view of unwrapping the problems that lead to those solutions. And we're trying to do the same thing with Lebanon. We have great new leadership everywhere. Great new leadership in Syria, great new leadership with the Prime Minister Nouaf and President Aoun in Lebanon, great new leadership here, and thank you for hosting, I think, what we all feel is one of the most important forums where we can actually have these discussions. In Qatar with Sheikh Tamim, MBS in Saudi Arabia, MBZ in UAE, we have a new set of opportunities. First thing that has to happen is we have to allow them, Syria, to define it themselves without going in with Western expectations of saying we want a democracy in 12 months. We've never had a democracy anyway. I don't see a democracy. Israel can claim that it's a democracy, but in this region, really what's worked the best, whether you like it or you don't like it, is a benevolent monarchy. That's the function of what's worked. So we're inventing something else. And every time the West steps in and says, okay, here is a kind of parliamentary dialogue that we want to have. Every time we step in, whether it's Libya, Iraq, all of the places that we've been to try and create a colonialized mandate, it has not been very successful. We end up with paralysis. So our view is give direction. All of us need to weigh in, not criticize, not say we need more foreign fighters released more quickly, not say we need more missing persons found more readily, not say the communities are being punished unfairly until they, in baby steps, get there. They just have taken over command and control. They need stability first. We need to give them the opportunity to incorporate all points of view, but at the end of the day, all points of view don't create a nation. They need to define what creates a nation. Is that centralization? Is it federalization? Is it a hybrid? What is it going to be? And from America's point of view, what we've learned is we are not good at imposing those expectations, especially in the Middle East, on others. Israel is a confusing situation. What I think this president and Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff have done, hand in hand with Qatar, by the way, and I'm here to tell you as a soldier on the ground, none of this would happen. Whatever we think about what happened in Israel, the greatest thing that ever happened is we got a ceasefire and return of hostages. It would not have happened without Qatar's intervention. It would just not have happened. And one of the most disappointing things, and I heard it was a great discussion between Tucker Carlson and Sheikh Mohammed. I'm telling you as somebody who's been in the middle of this, Sheikh Mohammed, under the Emir's tutelage, was the most important person for us to keep a dialogue with Hamas, no matter how the West views it, they were wrong. If we didn't have that, if Turkey didn't step in alongside, who was also criticized for having a dialogue with Hamas, we would not be where we are today. So we have to take a look at that as we look at Syria and Israel. It's baby steps. It's baby steps with Israel. It's a process, right? It's not an event. We're going to have speed bumps. We're going to have atrocities that continue. We're going to have dilemmas. We need to bring Lebanon and Syria together and aligned, two of the most ancient and beautiful civilizations. Iraq is having the same dilemma through paralysis in its own parliamentary process. We don't want to interfere in those political discussions. My hope and my belief is that we're going to go from the payphone to satellites. We're not going to have the iterative process. And the young leadership that we have in Syria, in Lebanon, in Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, holding their hands, I have great hope. But it takes all of us relieving the pressure we're putting on these places with what our expectations from the West are and giving them resources that they need.
Please.
Can I just, I very much would like to second that. I think what Tom Barak just said is incredibly important. When we say Syrian-owned and Syrian-led, it also means that we have to accept that they will find their way. The Syrian government tells us that they want an inclusive government. I welcome that. I think that's wise. But it's a Syrian choice, not my choice, nor America's choice. It's something they do. And I think we Westerners, historically, which I very much like to your point, is that we tend to forget how states emerge. You know, states emerge because somebody takes power, consolidates power against somebody else, and eventually you build a structure around that, and rule of law and so on comes later. And you know, it was not like, there was a country called Syria, it's still the same country, but it's not like a state that was ready and you just change a few people at the top. You actually have to consolidate that power in order to be able to do anything in that place. And this is sometimes overlooked. So I think a mature recognition of how these things work in practice is very welcome, will actually bring us further towards something that is stable and lasting in Syria. So I think that was really wise words.
Thank you for adding that. Minister Shaybani, I want to sort of bring back the same question I asked Ambassador Barak, but of course get your opinion on it. The challenge that you face with your Israeli neighbors is growing, I think. Last month, for the first time, we had more than 100 ground incursions in 30 days. On average, throughout the rest of the year, we've had half that. So a doubling of ground incursions in a month in November, which places very significant pressure on you and your government. Can you give us a bit of an update on what looks like a stalled track of direct talks which you had been engaged in, whether there is a prospect for that to be renewed, and of course, most importantly, what are your positions with regards to those talks? What are your red lines? What is your vision for where those talks would go in an ideal world?
شكرا لكم. حقيقة هو من أبرز التحديات التي ربما يعني يعيشها الشعب السوري حاليا وأيضا تعيشها سوريا حاليا بالمرحلة الانتقالية هي مسألة إسرائيل. الجانب الإسرائيلي منذ اليوم الأول في 8 ديسمبر العام الماضي والى اليوم هو الجانب المقلق للاستقرار في سوريا، وهو يعني إذا ما عملنا استقراء للسياسات الإسرائيلية تجاه سوريا، خاصة الإعلامية والسياسية وأيضا العسكرية والبرية، هناك يعني محاولة دائمة لزعزعة الاستقرار. إلا أننا أيضا نجحنا في يعني بكسب الكثير من الداعمين لمقاربة سوريا باتجاه إسرائيل، وأبرز هذه الدول الداعمة هي الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية التي أيضا هي داعمة لإجراء اتفاق أمني مع إسرائيل، وهذا ما نعمل عليه حاليا. الخط الأحمر الذي لدينا مع إسرائيل هو مسألة الانسحاب الإسرائيلي من سوريا، فلا يمكن أن نمضي في اتفاق أمني مع إسرائيل وإسرائيل تحتل أجزاء جديدة من سوريا بعد 8 ديسمبر، ويجب أن تعود الخريطة إلى ما كانت عليه في 7 ديسمبر العام الماضي، ويكون هناك يعني مقاربة ثنائية وأيضا عادلة للهواجس الأمنية للدولة السورية وأيضا للجانب الإسرائيلي. العملية الأمنية هي عملية ثنائية وتكاملية، لا يجب أن تكون من طرف واحد ولا تحترم الجانب الآخر. ونريد أيضا من الجانب الإسرائيلي أن يكف عن التدخل في الشؤون السورية، وأن أيضا أن يراهن على تحريك بعض الفئات من المجتمع السوري، أو أنه يغامر بمسألة تعزيز التفرقة في المجتمع السوري، فهذا ما سينعكس عليه سلبا أيضا في المستقبل. اليوم سوريا هي مركزة على سوريا، ونريد إعادة بناء بلدنا، ونريد أيضا علاقات هادئة مع الجميع بما فيها إسرائيل، ونحن ملتزمون باتفاقية 1974، وأيضا ملتزمون أيضا بالنهج الذي نقوده حاليا مع إسرائيل بوساطة أمريكية. وربما أبدت الحكومة السورية نضجا وعقلانية وأيضا دبلوماسية أكبر بكثير من الجانب الإسرائيلي الذي كان يعني في السابق يروج نفسه أنه النظام الديمقراطي الوحيد في الشرق الأوسط، ولكن أثبتت التجربة السورية على يعني حداثتها خلال عام واحد أنها أكثر عقلانية وأكثر دبلوماسية، واستطعنا أن نحشد الكثير من الأصدقاء في الدول العربية والأجنبية والأوروبية. فاليوم المجتمع الدولي داعم لمسار سوريا في هذا المجال، وكان آخره أيضا التصويت الذي اعترف أيضا مرة أخرى في الجولان كأرض سورية، وازداد ما يزيد عن 25 دولة داعمين لهذا التصويت عن العام الماضي.
Thank you. And Minister, I might just follow up with one more question before we run out of time to ask you about more on the side of economics and the economy. We are in Washington expecting some good news with regards to the repeal of the Caesar Act, which I think will be a huge opening of the window for all of the investment interest that has been declared, including here from Qatar and from the United States and elsewhere, From a very personal perspective, and I've been back to Syria 5 times since January, I've increasingly heard from ordinary Syrians the idea that, you know, with sanctions out of the way, there is an expectation of rapid improvements in terms of the quality of living. You know, how are you dealing with that challenge that all post-conflict countries will deal with, that the people expect more than is necessarily practical? There's a huge amount of reconstruction and rehabilitation that has to happen before we can see those real significant benefits. So how do you deal with that challenge, both of course from as you as the foreign minister, but more widely as the government?
إذا ما بما يخص الوضع في سوريا خاصة بعد 8 ديسمبر، أعتقد أننا نجحنا في أمور كثيرة، وأيضا لا زالت لدينا تحديات كبيرة جدا. فنحن لدينا مقاربة واقعية، ولدينا أيضا اعتراف بالواقع. بالتأكيد لو اجتمع العالم بأسره على أن يحول الوضع في سوريا خلال سنة واحدة من دولة كانت تحت يعني وطأة الحرب إلى دولة متقدمة خلال عام، يعني هذا الأمر يحتاج إلى وقت ويحتاج إلى إمكانيات ويحتاج أيضا إلى يعني خطط يعني مستدامة. لكن ما قلته في البداية أننا استطعنا أن نعزز ثقة الشعب السوري بنفسه، وهذا هو رأس مالنا الحقيقي، أن الشعب السوري يشعر بنفسه أنه قادر على أن يكون جزء حقيقي في بناء بلده. الشيء الآخر أيضا الحكومة السورية الحالية هي أيضا من يعني هي من خرجت أيضا هي من بين الشعب السوري، وهي أيضا عانت نفس المعاناة التي عاشها الشعب السوري خلال السنوات الماضية. وأيضا هناك يعني كل وزارة لديها خطة تطويرية في قطاعها. بالتأكيد هناك بعض الأمثلة التي تحسنت في سوريا، وخاصة موضوع الطاقة وموضوع الأمن وموضوع المواصلات. بالتأكيد موضوع الحرية السياسية وموضوع الحقوق وموضوع أيضا المشاركة السياسية وموضوع الانتماء الذي أيضا كان مختفيا أو يعني غير لم يكن على أجندة الشعب السوري في السابق، وكان هناك يعني غربة يعيشها الشعب السوري في وطنه، واليوم هذا الأمر قد تجاوزناه. إذا ما عملنا مقارنة، إذا ما قمنا بمقارنة بسيطة جدا بين 8 ديسمبر العام الماضي واليوم، سوريا كانت ربما من المواضيع المزعجة داخل البيت الأبيض. اليوم أصبحت الولايات المتحدة تشير صراحة إلى أن سوريا دولة شريكة لها، وأن أيضا سوريا كانت لدى الاتحاد الأوروبي كانت هي أيضا من المواضيع الإنسانية التي كانت تسعى كيف نرسل مساعدات، كيف نوقف الهجرة من سوريا. اليوم أصبحنا نتحدث عن كيف ننظم العودة إلى سوريا، وأيضا كيف نستثمر في سوريا. أيضا سوريا كانت هي في ينظر لها أنها كانت يعني مصدر للتهديد، اليوم أصبحت منظر ونموذج للإلهام والنجاح. الشعب السوري بنفسه كان ينظر إلى المستقبل بعين من الخوف واليأس، اليوم ينظر إلى المستقبل ويسارع يعني الخطى للمضي إلى المستقبل، لأنه يعتقد ويؤمن أن المستقبل سيشكل له الدولة التي يؤمن فيها. فاليوم أعتقد ما تم تحقيقه على الجانب المعنوي والجانب يعني إعادة تصوير سوريا وإعادة بناء تصورات حول سوريا خلال عام واحد، نجحنا في هذا الموضوع. بالتأكيد الجانب الخدمي والاقتصادي هذا ما ستركز عليه الحكومة السورية في عام 2026 وأيضا خلال الأعوام القادمة في جميع القطاعات، وكنا قد ركزنا على القطاعات الخدمية، وأيضا الصناعة أيضا عادت إلى سوريا، وأيضا انتعشت القطاعات الأساسية بشراكات مع الشركات الأمريكية، وأيضا شركات قطرية وشركات سعودية وشركات تركية. وهناك اليوم رغبة كبيرة جدا في الاستثمار في سوريا. فنحن كشعب سوري أو كسوريا حقيقة لسنا خائفين من التقدم الاقتصادي والتقدم في مستوى العيش وإعادة بناء بلدنا، لأن هذا لدينا الرأس مال الحقيقي وهو الشعب السوري. ما نخشاه هو التهديدات الأمنية التي نراها إما من داعش أو من الجانب الإسرائيلي أو من ميليشيات عابرة الحدود لم ترضى بالتغيير الذي حصل في سوريا. وأعتقد أننا إن شاء الله في منتدى الدوحة العام القادم سنتكلم عن نماذج حقيقية للنجاح الميداني الذي حصل في سوريا، خاصة أن اليوم أصبح الكل يعني وهناك حقيقة هذا أمر يجب أيضا نعترف فيه، هناك رغبة دولية لرؤية سوريا دولة ناجحة، وأن تكون قد تخلصت من نظام دكتاتوري شمولي، وألا تقع في فخ الدولة الفاشلة وتنتقل إلى نظام ملهم، وأيضا يعني يبث بعض الأمل ويبث بعض المعنويات خاصة في دول الشرق الأوسط وفي العالم.
Thank you very much. And you took the words out of my mouth. That was going to be my closing, which is, yes, hopefully when we gather here a year from now, we will be celebrating even greater achievements of stability and prosperity for Syria. The only other thing I will say here is thank you to all of our esteemed panelists. I wish we had another 45 minutes. And in the meantime, good luck to Syria tonight.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you to all your panelists for this engaging discussion. I will not stand between all of you and one of the most anticipated moments of the day, lunch. But we hope to see you back here at 1:45 when we resume with a newsmaker interview with the Lebanese Prime Minister, Dr. Nawaf Salam. We'll see you back here at 1:45. Thank you.